Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 7th meeting of 2020. Before we move into the first item on the agenda, can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones or at least put them on silent, as they may affect the broadcasting system. We have apologies from Angus MacDonald and Stuart Stevenson today. Our first item today is to decide whether to take agenda Item 5 in private, the committee's consideration on the evidence heard on the draft regulations at today's meeting. Are members content to do that? Content. Thank you. Our second item today is to welcome our new committee member and ask her if she'd like to declare any relevant interests. That's Annie Wells. But before I do that, I'd like to put on record the committee's thanks to Rachel Hamilton for all her hard work during her time with this committee, and she's moved on. So, Annie Wells, would you like to declare anything?
Thank you, Convener. I'm very much looking forward to being part of the committee, and I have no interest to declare.
Okay, thank you and welcome to the committee. Our third item is to hear evidence on the proposed draft regulations to establish a register of persons holding a controlled interest in land. We have two panels this morning. We have our first panel in front of us now. We have Dr Callum MacLeod, the Policy Director of Community Land Scotland, Hamish Trench, the Chief Executive of Scottish Land Commission, John Sinclair of the Property Law Committee and the Property and Land Law Reform Subcommittee of the Law Society of Scotland. Put that on a t-shirt. And Alan Cook, Commercial Real Estate Committee Chair of the Scottish Property Federation. And I thank you all for coming in this morning. So you'll be... We've taken evidence on this before, and quite a lot of work has been done in relation to some of the issues that were flagged up early on. And there's been some changes made to the proposed regulations. I would like to get your view, first of all, on whether you feel that there are any outstanding loopholes in these regulations that might be problematic, that we should maybe be drawing our attention to.
Perhaps if I can talk to that. The regulations which have been laid now are definitely a sort of improvement in a number of respects compared to the first set of regulations, the first draft that came out. So we're sort of very pleased to see a number of matters have moved on in a sort of really positive way. One area though that I do feel there's still, I think, a lack of clarity which could result in the aims of the regulations not being fully satisfied is in relation to the references to significant influence and control, and whether or not it's capturing all of the correct scenarios and circumstances. The Scottish Property Federation's interest is in relation to commercial ownerships of commercial land and buildings, typically in an urban scenario. It's important to make sure that the regulations and the explanatory notes that accompany them do allow for the scenarios that arise in those sorts of circumstances. I think my concern is about circumstances where there's influence which doesn't extend to legal power to direct, but which is nevertheless a strong influence exerted over the legal owners of the land, those whose name is on the title deeds. So, for example, a scenario which could arise is where, say, you have a shopping centre or an office building or something like that, which might be owned by a Jersey unit trust, for the sake of argument. So that's an offshore trust, so firmly within the regulations, and that's not an uncommon ownership scenario, and the reason for that is for tax-related reasons, tax planning reasons, which are perfectly legitimate reasons to hold the land on that basis. But the Jersey trustees, whose name is on the title, are not those who are in practice making the day-to-day decisions in relation to the land. The day-to-day decisions, and with a small d, are being made by usually asset managers within a pension fund, a UK pension fund quite typically. And their locus in relation to it is by virtue of an asset management agreement, which gives them responsibilities to look after the land, to collect rents, to find tenants and to deal with everything that happens on a day-to-day basis, as well as broader strategy in relation to whether the asset should still be held or what should happen to it. But they don't have any power to make decisions. They make recommendations, and they make recommendations to the trustees. It's invariably going to be the case that the trustees will follow those recommendations, and that the sort of recommendation that's been made to enter into a lease or to sell or whatever it might be is followed. But legally, it's not the pension fund, the asset manager, who is making the decisions. And I feel that there's some difficulty. It's not entirely clear how that scenario works in terms of the way that the defined terms of significant influence and control are framed, where they have language that talks about being able to ensure that an approach is followed, or having a power to direct activities. And looking at those words, it feels to me not to be at all fours with the scenario where somebody is making recommendations which you can expect to be followed, but which are not a legal power.
On the one hand, you are able to contact, the register would give you the tools in order to contact somebody, in order to find out, you know, how to contact somebody who owns a piece of land that you might have an interest in for whatever reason, and you'd be able to get that contact via the list. But it's the transparency issue as to everyone who's behind that, in terms of the kind of, as you say, the people who've actually got financial interests in that land.
That's right.
The issue.
If the purpose of the regulations, as I understand it to be, is to find out who to talk to actually have a proper discussion about something to do with the land, then that's the person you want to speak to. It's the pension fund asset manager.
Yeah.
And the regulations ought to work in a manner that therefore allows people to be directed towards them. But I just don't feel that it's clear. I think if an asset manager was looking at these regulations just now, deciding whether or not they needed to declare themselves as an associate, then I don't think it's entirely clear.
Right.
And I don't think that the explanatory notes really address it either. I know there's been some discussion before about whether there was discussion before in the last discussion at the meeting about whether giving advice might be enough, but that isn't what the regulations say. So I would be nervous about tinkering too much with the words in the regulations to try and capture this, because the more that you open it up, the more you will bring in people who shouldn't be brought in.
Yeah, look, where do you draw the line?
Yeah. So I feel that perhaps the best approach to take is for the explanatory notes to be expanded to clarify the application for these particular circumstances. Okay. Yeah. At the moment, I don't think they're quite there on that.
So are you suggesting there should be an obligation on whoever's registering that interest, whether it's significant control or influence, whatever, has an obligation to be able to provide the information that is likely to be asked of them? So rather than get mixed up with the definitions of significant influence, controlling interest, it's actually quite simple. Whoever is the named person in this register has to be able to respond to the type of question that's going to be expected to be asked.
Well, I think it's about identifying who the right person is in the first place, and having that name on the getting that name onto the register in the first place. I think that's the difficulty, that it's not entirely clear that that name should go onto the will end up in the register in the first place.
Down to the registry, or is it down to the organisation that ultimately makes that decision? So is it a question that the person providing information should make, rather than the registry put it into an absolute definition?
Yeah, so individuals, persons who have got a recorded ownership and have got a duty to register associates in relation to the land, need to make decisions based on the regulations as to whether or not a particular person needs to be declared as an associate. And at the moment, I don't feel that it's clear enough that in those sorts of scenarios that it would be clear that that sort of person certainly should be declared as an associate.
Okay.
Any other panel members? John?
Two things, really. Firstly, I would agree with what Alan has said, that the need for greater guidance provided to the regulations, I think, is important. That one of the issues that the regulations will have are that the concepts that you're trying to track through of significant influence and control are very, very difficult concepts to define. And you can see in the regulations that the more the regulations get into it, the more they build inconsistencies and the more they refer to other concepts that are less clear. And so I think that given the concepts that you're trying to track through, it may be difficult to make the regulations themselves any better, but the idea that there is clearer, fuller guidance available so that people are both very clear about what is not covered rather than, and what is covered. Secondly, not so much a loophole, but we would recommend that the drafters look again at section, or the interaction between section or regulation 10.1 and regulation 3.3. Which simply, regulation 10.1 obliges the control person to submit information to the register. Regulation 3.3 defines, sorry, the recorded person to the register. Regulation 3.3 defines the recorded person as the person on the register. The previous drafting set out in more detail in regulation 10.1 who was to submit and didn't refer to the defined term, which was avoided creating a circularity.
Okay. Hamish Trench.
Yeah, I would start by just coming back to the core purpose of this register, I think, which is about transparency of control. And I think it's more than transparency of contact information. I think it is transparency of control and the power that is associated with land ownership in any circumstances. And I suppose I would just start by kind of reiterating how fundamental that is to the Scotland's wider programme of land reform. It's quite striking, for example, how often in public meetings we still get examples raised where simply finding out, the clarity of information on ownership is still a key barrier to actually taking forward a project, whether that be a kind of bit of vacant and derelict land in a city centre or a bit of rural land. It's still a very real issue in actually establishing the ownership information. So I think our overall view is that this is, this will be a huge step forward in providing that transparency. Yes, there's some complexity built in, given the nature of the registers, but it is a huge step forward. And we would certainly strongly support a good focus on kind of ease of access of the information.
Yeah, we're going to come on to talking about that, but I'll bring in Dr MacLeod first, if you want to make any comments on my initial question.
Thank you very much, Convener. I mean, I think the issue of loopholes in terms of the associate themselves and the control they may have, that's something that will clearly have to come through in terms of the broader guidance, I think, in that context. And that reiterates, I think, as well, the issue about making sure that the regulations themselves are monitored on a regular basis, clearly in terms of their efficacy, which is clearly very important, has been brought up in terms of previous submissions and written evidence as well from Global Witness, for example. So, yeah, in that sense, clearly there will inevitably be issues, anomalies, loopholes that will come through. They will come through over time, and we need to be vigilant in relation to them. But certainly the issue of guidance with regard to some of the issues that are not on the face of the regulations is critically important in that context as well.
There'll be a lot of testing of the actual mechanisms now to access the register, but that ability to reflect on how it's done as users give it a go and find out where the difficulties lie, we can be reflecting on that.
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. And clearly, as I'm sure we're going to go on to discuss, there are a variety of issues where that all connects up, really, in terms of different elements and how they are implemented in practice, and to ensure there isn't a gap between the policy intent, which is, as Hamish indicates, fundamentally about transparency of land ownership in Scotland because of the implications that has in terms of power relationships, sustainable development and communities and societal impact in that sense, I think.
I should mention, you mentioned Global Witness, that Megan McInnes was invited, unfortunately couldn't make it, but she has actually included a written submission which outlines some of the points. She echoes quite a lot of what you've said already and more. Claudia, you had a question.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to you all. Could I just follow up with a question to yourself, Callum, about, you said about the monitoring in terms of efficacy. Should that, in your view, be the one of the duties of the keeper? And if so, how often should that monitoring be happening?
Monitoring in terms of the efficacy of the way in which obviously the register is working in practice. I think there is, the keeper indeed will have a view on this herself, but certainly there is a case to be made, I would suggest, in terms of that power being given to the keeper, certainly. Because it's, as Convener said, it's critically important to ensure that these regulations, as with any the land reform regulations and other areas of public policy as well, are working in the spirit and the practice of the intent of the legislation. So I think that is something that should certainly be considered, I think, quite strongly. As to the regularity of such a function being undertaken in practice, I mean, you could take different perspectives on that, of course, but an annual basis as a starter would not be an unreasonable, I would suggest, possibility in that regard.
Thank you.
That this is a tool that is available to the populace of Scotland in order to find out who owns what and how they can get hold of them. Reading a lot of it and doing the work that we have, I think one of the concerns that some of us have had is that you have to be a property lawyer to understand a lot of the definitions around this. Are the definitions clear, and will they be accessible to anybody in terms of understanding, especially when you've actually got to declare an interest yourself? I mean, because we're not just talking about people who've got, you know, miles and miles of countryside. You know, we're talking about ordinary people who might have a piece of land that's actually quite small. We're talking about empire. Emperors of all that they survey in every instance. How accessible is the language in this, and how clear are the definitions in it? John Sinclair.
From the Law Society perspective, we do have a concern about the clarity and the risk of inadvertently criminalising members of the public for non-disclosure. We also think that there's possibly in relation to partnerships, a large number of partnerships that would fall within, or which would be a recorded person in terms of the regulations. And so, from the public perspective, we have, I think, more concerns about the understanding and the knowledge and the communication of the duties to register than we do have about accessibility, particularly if the register is accessible through Scotlas, which is from my experience of it, is a very intuitive system and allows map-based searching. And so the difficulties or the difficulties in getting consistency between people's understanding of what an associate is, that won't impact once the person is on the register. I don't think that will impact in that you look at the register, you see there is an associated person. Once you know that there's an associated person, my view is that the reason for them being an associate is less important at that stage than that there is an associate. And so from the perspective of the public trying to access the register, I think that the difficulties of the definitions won't impact on them. I think it'll be more for the public who should be registering.
Anyone else get any thoughts on that before we move on to talk about other aspects of this?
I would agree with what John has said. So I think for somebody who's accessing the register, the detail of the regulations is not really going to be relevant for them. It's going to be about what information is on the register. The difficulty will be for those who are trying to work out whether they ought to be declaring onto the register in the first place, and that's going to be the difficulty. It's just exactly as John said.
Yeah. Finlay.
Looking at the importance of consistency across the register and completeness of the register, how important is how the person's name and address is recorded? So in terms of making sure that all the different registers tie up and it's transparent and clear. There has been an argument about whether we should include email addresses. It would appear that that would be a simple addition to future-proof the information and the way people respond to online data and so on. So what's your thoughts on how important the consistency is right across?
don't think that the inclusion of email addresses would be helpful at all in future-proofing the register. Email addresses come and go. If you're putting a particular contact onto an email as an email address, it's probably going to be an individual's email address, and email addresses change. When we as lawyers are writing contracts, and there's usually a clause in the contract which says how you go about serving notices on the person and what the contact details are for that. There's usually a lot of reticence to include email addresses as part of the arrangements for that. Because of that, precisely because of that, they come and go. They can be missed if if somebody changes their internet provider, then it doesn't exist anymore. Whereas a postal address is a much more robust way of doing it. So I've been nervous about using email addresses, and I think there's been a suggestion that email addresses might perhaps be part of what is included in the information that's provided to the keeper, more for an operational purposes rather than for the purposes of the official register. And I think that's perhaps the way to approach it.
Yeah, that would certainly, my thoughts, it would expedite any correspondence between the register and potentially for a verification right in the initial set up the database. Can you maybe give us your ideas about a unique reference number for associates? So we've heard that it may be that one landowner or somebody with controlling interest might have multiple pockets of land or whatever, and that could be dealt with having an associate number. Can you maybe give us your ideas on what the pitfalls of that would be, or the advantages of having an associate number?
We were in favour of Global Witness's proposal or suggestion of a unique identifying number. We think it is good for capturing the instances where you have an associate that appears in multiple, or is associated with multiple sections or areas of land. I think in terms of the fine-tuning of the detail, I think there is an absolute requirement in the regulations to provide that associate's unique identifying number in the registration. We would prefer that there was some scope for only providing it if it was known to the person that was making the registration.
Callum, Clyde?
I think the issue of the postal address as the fundamental point of contact is an important one in terms of that. But I agree as well in terms of the use of an email address potentially at an operational level and how that might fit in. So I think that there's merit in relation to that. But the issue of consistency that you raise is fundamentally important right across the board with regard to this register, and it fits in with others in various elements, not least in terms of compliance, which I'm sure we'll come on to later. But certainly, yes, Community Land Scotland is also highly supportive of the proposal that Global Witness made with regard to these unique reference numbers for associates.
Okay.
Yeah, we would absolutely agree. The unique reference number seems to be the most appropriate way of ensuring the most consistency across there, although the keeper can obviously advise on the kind of technical need for consistency. And again, coming back to the core purpose of transparency, it seems the postal address should be the main focus in terms of identification.
I just wanted to add, sorry. Just again, the SPF again agrees with that. That the use of the unique identifier number, I think, is a good step forward. And there had been some concerns previously about the disclosure of dates of birth, for example. And the reason for disclosure of date of birth originally, I think, the rationale was about being able to work out which John Smith you were among a number of John Smiths. So having a unique identifier, gets away with that and deals with the data protection issues that surround that as well.
Sorry, if I can bend, does that allow people to hide behind it?
No, because it's still going to be clear. I think as long as there are adequate contact details that go with the unique identifier. So if you're a particular John Smith, then, and you've got an identifier, a unique number, then it ought to still be clear from the register how you then contact that John Smith, but it will allow you to know that it's that John Smith and not another John Smith. I also think it will help in terms of if there was in terms of the searchability of the register, because it will. I think there's an intention. The keeper can perhaps clarify this, but my understanding is there is an intention for it to be sort of searchable, perhaps by associate or in different ways, and that will assist the searchability of the register as well, I feel.
John Sinclair.
Sorry, just my understanding is that the unique identifier is to be in addition to the other information contained for the associate, and so they would not represent a tool for obscuring the register. It would also, just perhaps to leap onto other areas, for security declarations, it might in some circumstances make sense for it to be an interim alternative to the full details on the register. But I think that would be the only circumstance in which there are currently, I think, no circumstances where the unique identifier could be hidden behind.
Right.
But there may be a circumstance where it would make sense to allow that to happen, at least on an interim basis.
Yeah, and we are going to come on to the whole security thing. Dr. McLeod, you want to come in?
I did, but it's in a different point, so I don't think it's the appropriate place to do that.
But make your point.
I think it was really just around, it's back around issues of consistency and kind of accessibility for users as opposed to people on the register, or entities on the register. And one of the points is that's been made in relation to privacy is the fact that this is going to be a free-to-use register, which is good. But in terms of accessing the data, because you said yourself, convener, that it can be quite daunting for people to actually navigate their way around that. One of the points that I think was made, and we would support this in Global Witness's submission, was around being able to access the register using an open data approach, which to my understanding is basically where you can go in and manipulate and actually take, almost at your leisure, the data from it and in effect play about with it and use it in a more flexible way than perhaps is necessarily the case at the moment, as I understand it, and would be consistent, I think, with, for example, the PSC register, UK level as well. So there's quite an important point, I think, about the usability or the efficacy of the register as well from a user perspective in that sense. So that would be something that I think we would encourage if it's possible.
Okay. Back to you, Finn. Sorry.
Just back to the completeness of the register, and very much in practical terms, to get an initial indication of how accurate the register is. Do you think there's a requirement for some sort of verification? So when an entry is made in the register, it could be a letter sent to the person who's registered with interest, and they're required to acknowledge that. So on the very simplest basis, a letter saying this is the information we contain in the database referring to your land ownership. Can you confirm this is the case by returning the tariff slip at the bottom? Something along that basis. Is that something that would help give us confidence that the registry actually held accurate information and it was fit for purpose as soon as possible?
I think that's a really important issue, and it's one that's been it was raised in a previous evidence session that some of us participated in, and your previous session as well. I think there's a really important issue here around verification and validation, I suppose, of the data. Absolutely. Now, at the moment, as we know, in terms of regulations, as we understand it at least, that the keeper can go through undertake a validation, a verification process. So I hope I'm not being too fast and loose in my terminology here, but can go through a verification process if they're alerted to that by a third party. Now, we've argued, and so have Global Witness in their written submission, that the keeper should have the power to actually do that without the necessity to go to a third party. And as you explored in your previous session, the 4th of February, with the build team and Scottish Government officials, there are some potential quite practical ways in which that can be done in terms of the sort of verification approach you talked about. I think just that kind of tear-off slip almost approach in relation to that. I think there was some discussion from Mr. Ruskell around verification with regard to utility bills or some sort of element in relation to that. So clearly we would argue or contend at least that there's a real value in doing that to ensure that the information is as robust and is actually going to do what the intent of the policy is in practice.
I got the feeling there was some resistance to that, and I would imagine that's because of the resources required to do that. Do you feel there's that resistance to initial verification, and do you think it's simply down to the resources and the cost of carrying out that operation?
I would suspect that's the case. Sorry, I would. It would be easy to imagine that there's clearly some issue around the resource implications of that, I suppose.
Okay, we'll come to John Sinclair and then Hamish Trench.
From the Law Society's perspective, we would have a concern about ensuring that Registers of Scotland was properly resourced. And to go from the function of a register to an investigative body is a really big step, both in terms of resourcing and in principle. And so if that was to be the direction of travel, then we would recommend that there is that the volume of resource required to make an effective difference with that sort of function should be looked at very, very carefully, because it is not an easy thing to do. And when you look at the concepts behind significant influence and control, actually there's a lot of this information will be very, very hard to actually objectively verify. And so you start off with a process and you realize that it actually is hard to make it effective, particularly from the starting point of a registration function. The other comment we would make is that, particularly when you are looking into structures of trusts and unincorporated associations, there is a very, very definite skill set in reviewing those structures, and way beyond mine as a property lawyer. And so there is, I think, a question over whether the keeper would be the right, or the Register of Scotland would be the right entity for this, both in terms of the nature of the function, but also in terms of the skill set. And we have a similar concern about the Lands Tribunal as being a point of reference, that their skill set is centered around property transactions, whereas actually the concepts behind significant influence and control are not really property concepts.
They're probably more forensics.
Corporate accountancy.
Yeah.
Basically black magic of corporate structures that I know nothing about.
Hamish Trench.
Yes, I mean, it seems there's kind of realistic caution about both powers and resources in terms of the validation proposals. I suppose even if validation across the piece is not possible in the short term, it seems to me that some form of testing is going to be required as we go forward, probably most realistically as part of a monitoring and review system. And it would seem critical in terms of building confidence in the consistency and accuracy of the register, that at least on a sample basis or at some point during the early establishment, some form of validation would need to be carried out as part of the monitoring and review process.
Yes.
Apologies. Can I just add to that? There's already a mechanism for associates to agree that their name is going to appear in the register at the point when the recorded person contacts them at the start of the process and gives them 60 days or whatever it is to respond and say yes, they agree that they're the associate, and the registration then gets made. And I'd be nervous, firstly I'd be nervous about another layer of sort of bureaucracy, if you like, of a further set of process for the associate then to agree that yes, they were the right person to appear. And then secondly, I would absolutely agree with the comments that turning the keeper from being a holder of the register into being some sort of policeman, I think is a big change. Yeah. There's a resourcing issue and also a skill set issue there. It's not, I don't feel that that's really the purpose of the Registers of Scotland to have that responsibility. And the responsibility should be on those people who are to be making the declarations in the first place, and to have an enforcement regime based around them rather than the keeper having some sort of responsibility to be verifying in some way. By all means, have a sampling if you feel that perhaps have a sampling to give some sort of sense of surety that overall the system is working right. But I don't think that's the same thing as having an overall validation responsibility. Yeah.
Mark, you wanted to ask a question around this?
Yeah, I mean, the system is effectively self-declaratory, isn't it? With threat of a fine potentially if people are not putting in accurate information or not putting in a return at all. I'm just wondering what kind of proportion of individuals that are entering into the register may end up, you know, effectively putting in a wrong registration, therefore would potentially go into a verification process. I mean, presumably we're talking about very small numbers. I'm just wondering if you've got any sense of how many people would be on this register, full stop, and out of those people, how many may require to go through some kind of verification process.
If I can just talk to that for a moment. I did see some reference in some of the background documentation for the register where the Scottish Government were trying to sort of quantify who would be the numbers of people that might be caught by this, and they were having a great deal of difficulty in doing that, perhaps by virtue of the very fact that, you know, there is, if you're trying to deal with a lack of transparency, then how can you quantify the extent to which there's a lack of transparency? So, you know, I'm sure it will be in the thousands. I think you have to draw a distinction between those who will inadvertently not get it right or not do it in the first place inadvertently, and we've got to be very cautious about the response to that in terms of the criminality aspect of compliance. I'm sure we'll come on to that, versus those who might deliberately choose to not to register or to give false information. I'd have thought that that would be, you know, that surely I feel is going to be a real, you know, a really small subset. And of course, it's the same with, for example, you know, anti-money laundering legislation. There's a whole framework around ensuring compliance with that. And it's the people who are determined not to comply who are not going to comply anyway. But I feel for this, it's going to be a really small subset. And the threat of criminal sanction is, you know, is an important one, which people will be, you know, mindful of. So I think it's much
obviously
more
difficult to stick a number on it. But
yeah.
Are we talking tens or hundreds?
I think it'll, in terms of those who will inadvertently comply,
If there was a need to carry out investigation leading to you know.
I think it could easily, you know, I'm you know, putting a finger in the air, but you know, it could easily be the hundreds into the thousands. It's very difficult to tell in terms of how many trusts are out there where the trustees are not going to realise that the names that are on the title deeds are not the same as the actual decision makers, for example.
And you mentioned earlier on about a sampling regime, which would be another way to do it, to basically do random sampling to carry out an investigatory process to make sure that information that's been submitted is accurate. How would that work? Because that feels more manageable in terms of potentially the role of the keeper to do that work. Would that be a certain proportion? Is there a precedent elsewhere in terms of what would be an effective sampling regime?
Well, I can't think of any precedents. I think it's enforcement you know, enforcement. I feel that enforcement it's an element of enforcement really. And I feel that there would be some difficulty in expecting the keeper to fulfil that function to a degree of asking for what are they going to do? They're going to ask for background information, ask for the documentation that demonstrates that it's true that the name on of the associate that's been declared is the correct one. You know, to understand that, as John said, potentially could involve hundreds of pages of corporate documentation. I suspect the keeper doesn't want to go there, and I don't think the keeper would have the skill set to do that. I'm sure the keeper can speak for herself, but I think it would be quite an unfair thing to ask the keeper to be doing.
It's just you mentioned it yourself, so I wondered if you thought through exactly what that would mean and who would actually do that work.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know whether there needs. I don't know whether there needs to be somebody other than the keeper who is tasked. You know, I hesitate to go there, but you know, sort of, you know, you talk about the Crown Office, or you know, because you're starting to go in the direction of who do you want to prosecute here.
Like, get this process, get these procedures up and running, get these registers up and running in a way, and then it's an ongoing review of how if they're meeting the objectives or not. Would actually prompt whether or not we actually need to have anything like that.
I feel that that's perhaps a more proportionate way to approach it. Absolutely. You know, the register will find its way, and it'll either be deemed to be in broad terms a success or to be a flop, or to be not achieving its functions. If it's not achieving its functions, there will, I think, be some understanding at that point as to why it's not achieving its functions. There's bound to be some understanding of that, and then I think you target the reasons why it's not achieving its functions. I think that's probably more important.
John Sinclair, you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, and then what I was about to say has just been said. I think basically the monitoring, the checking, I think is a very, very good thing, but I think it should be monitored and checked from the perspective of achieving the policy objectives, rather than particularly the successful application of the particular rules. And so I think that the monitoring and checking would not then be done by Registers of Scotland, it would be done externally with more of a view to the policy objectives being met rather than the actual application of the rules.
Okay, I'm going to come back to Finlay.
Yeah, so, just to be clear, do the regulations and guidance need to more clearly set out the responsibilities and arrangements for non-compliance? So if a community was to, or an individual was to send a letter to who was registered as the controlling interest and there was no response, does it need to be clearer how the process of enforcement or the process of non-compliance would be investigated? I know we're suggesting it's not the register that should be doing that. So which body should actually undertake that forensic corporate investigation or whatever? Is that clearer? Is it clear in the regulations how that would play out?
I'm happy to stand corrected, but I think the process is an application to the Lands Tribunal, which is a cumbersome and expensive process, or well, can be a cumbersome and expensive process.
So, so at the moment, are you suggesting it's not fit for purpose what's suggested, and there needs to be something else or someone else who looks at that non-compliance in terms of what we've discussed with it, working out the corporate black magic?
I'm going to regret that term. I wouldn't say it's not fit for purpose. I think it's simply too early to say how this will work. I think that there is something to be said for the formal process of going to the Lands Tribunal to identify or to raise or deal with a concern from a third party. It may make sense to have a less formal process. But we haven't, I don't think the Law Society has considered that as a question.
I would also just say that there are two aspects to non-compliance. There's submitting a return, but it not being the right answer, and there's not submitting a return at all. And I think you've got to be clear, about that distinction. I think trying to sort of verify the information which has been submitted could be, that's one thing. I think not complying at all or not submitting at all is a different thing. And they're almost, I think they are different things. And also the reasons, again, as I said before, the reasons for that can be either because it's inadvertent or because it's deliberate. I suspect the deliberate evasion of the rules or deliberately giving a false return will be a really small subset.
Are you satisfied with what's been put in place around that, about giving people that period of time, from when the register's first set up? As you said, we don't want to criminalise people who've genuinely made a mistake. So, yeah.
I think that's been extended, hasn't it, in terms of the first iteration of the regulations themselves. So I think, clearly we don't want to, nobody wants to be in a position where somebody's inadvertently made a mistake, a genuine mistake is criminalised, clearly. But I'm intrigued by John's phrase of corporate black magic. I mean, one of the problems is that, a number of entities have been doing a vanishing act for quite some time, and it's really important that we actually ensure that we are able to track fundamentally the ownership and the controlling interest in relation to that. And I do think there's an important, we're exploring various elements in terms of how this kind of validation enforcement process might work in practice, and clearly there are different views with regard to that. But the critical point is, and I would take issue with the relationship between policy intent and the regulations, because the regulations ultimately are what will give flesh to the policy intent in practice. So we do, I think, need to make sure that there's a clear line between that in practice from what's desirable in terms of achievement, what we get in terms of that. So whether it's the keeper that has that responsibility, whether it's done on a kind of sampling basis to be potentially explored further down the line, but in relation to the kind of monitoring element that you've talked about. But it's, I mean, that sampling approach is not necessarily one that I would have thought is beyond the wit of humankind to actually come up with a solution in relation to how to do that. Now, who does it is, you know, to be confirmed.
Yeah. We're going to move on to talk about security, and this was something that was brought up by our former colleague on the committee, Richard Lyle, opened up a lot of questions around this. About just protecting people who might be vulnerable, who have got, you know, an interest in land and they run this register, but the fact that if their identity is out there, it might be able to be used by people who might want to perpetrate harm on them. Are you content with what's been put in place around this? It was an early discussion that seems to have been teased out in the next draft of the regulations. You want to give us your view on whether you think that's fit for purpose? Yeah, John.
We have a few concerns with the way the regulations are drafted at present. At present, there is a 60-day period for provision of evidence, which failing, there is a direction that the security declaration is to cease to have effect. The concern we have is the hard cut-off, that to have such a hard cut-off, we should then leave it either the associate or a person connected with the associate with their details on a public register, we think is adverse. That there might be circumstances where there should be longer or more than 60 days should be provided for the provision of evidence. The Regulation 16 does provide for the keeper to ask for more information, but there's a lack of clarity as to how the period within which that information can be provided sits with the fixed 60-day period. So we would welcome some greater flexibility in relation to that period. We also note that when a security declaration is made, the associate has to send the security declaration to the recorded person. And so without mapping through fully the circumstances in which a security declaration could arise, I think there's a question as to whether or not it would always be appropriate for the recorded person actually to have the details of the security declaration, particularly if it's not in connection with the associate, but with a person connected with the associate. And then on a final matter, we would welcome a declaration in the registration that the recorded person is not aware of their associate having any need for a security declaration as an added layer of just keeping it in people's consciousness.
Okay, that's very helpful. Any other thoughts on the security of potentially vulnerable people?
Just simply to obviously reiterate that anybody who is in a vulnerable position should not have that their position compromised in any way, clearly in relation to that. With regard to the definition of who's involved in terms of the security declarations, we're, I think, comfortable with that as they stand, certainly. And we wouldn't, as I think Global Witness have said as well, wouldn't necessarily want to have that expanded any further at this point.
Okay.
Again, looking at who is the most appropriate body to look at this, is the Land Tribunal the most appropriate body to look at appeals potential when it comes to security? If it's, you know, some of the things that were raised were domestic abuse or things like that, is it still appropriate the Land Tribunal ultimately the arbitrator when it came to making that decision?
It's not necessarily within the skill set of the Lands Tribunal, which is a property-based tribunal. Just the other thing I'd say is that in terms of whether creating more flexibility in relation to the security declaration is to be perceived as a loophole or not, the range of people that are able to claim a security declaration is defined and are not of. It's hard to see how this would be used as a tool to subvert the register, and so I don't think there should be a concern about the security declaration being used as a loophole.
Okay. Right. Claudia, you have some questions.
Thank you, Convener. I've got some questions about the criminal offences that relate to this, these regulations and the differences in fines. I'd like to start with for similar offences across registers. For instance, the persons of significant control, as I understand it, it's a fine of up to £10,000 or £10,000 rather, and this is £5,000 as I understand it. So I'd like to know in terms of the deterrent effect of this, and obviously there's also the deterrent effect as well as the risk of a fine of the actual criminality aspect. But if there are comments from the panel on this or other aspects of criminal offences, that would be helpful.
Yes, I mean, I think it seems to us that consistency would be appropriate in terms of the sanctions. I understand the argument of whether indeed 5,000 or 10,000 would be a deterrent to, in the kind of circumstances we're talking about. In practice, the financial sum may not be significant, but certainly as a signal, in terms of the signal it sends, consistency would seem appropriate. But I think fundamentally would agree that actually the criminal sanction appears to be the most significant element of the sanctions.
What would you see as an appropriate proportionate fine if you're saying that, I understand your argument, obviously we all do about consistency, but what if it's more than 10,000 because of somebody attempting to hide goodness knows what, what would that figure be in your...
Well, I think the difficulty is it's probably impossible to put a figure on what would be proportionate in these different kind of circumstances and different kind of partnerships and companies and structures. So I would come back to consistency being a pretty good basis for it.
Right. Other panel members? Callum?
Yes, well, I think the issue of consistency is fundamentally important in relation to this. As you've noted, committee, and as has been discussed previously in evidence, there are other UK-wide registers that have a larger fine regime in terms of total there. So it would seem, from our perspective at least, logical to have consistency with regard to that in terms of the deterrent. And as I understand it, it's fines of up to that amount as well, as opposed to necessarily that finite element in relation to it. And basically here, there is an issue, and there was some discussion about this, I think, at your previous evidence session around what the policy intent of this particular register is, and, for example, the policy intent of the persons of significant control register. Fundamentally, certainly from where Community Land Scotland's sitting and viewing this, the policy intent is one and the same. It's about transparency of information and ensuring that people have got access to that fundamental right to have that information. So I'm not sure personally, and Community Land Scotland would not be sure as an organisation, that the policy intents are diverging in that sense. So again, that makes sense to have consistency across the board. And again, there's the other UK overseas entities, I think I may be paraphrasing here, register that is mentioned in Global Witness's submission as well in terms of a consistent approach there. The other thing as well, though, that I think is of considerable interest and we would support as an organisation is around the potential for cross-compliance, or a precondition rather, to have completed a submission to the Register of Controlled Interests as a prerequisite for undertaking types of administrative or financial transactions on the land register, which I think is what Global Witness have suggested. Now, that, there will be different views on that, of course, but that, I think, would add another element to the suite of, if you like, enforcement powers which would be available in relation to ensuring compliance to this very fundamental aspect of what our relationship in Scotland with land is about, effectively.
Thank you.
John Sinclair.
Would it be appropriate to respond on the references to controlling the administrative functions of the land register at this point?
Yes.
The Law Society view is that we would not be in favour of that. This is the same issue that came up with the Register of Overseas Businesses. The concern that we have is that you would end up punishing the wrong person. That one of the consequences of the provisions that are proposed for the Register of Overseas Entities is that you could have a scenario where a good faith purchaser settles a transaction, pays money to the overseas entity, or in this case, the recorded person, and then finds that their disposition, for whatever reason, is then rejected due to either a historic non-compliance, or if the disposition is subsequently rejected by the keeper and needs to be represented, you would then be retesting compliance with a register that the controlled person would think they no longer needed to be on because they had sold their property. And so, A, we think this will increase costs and it will add risk to good faith purchasers in Scotland. B, the Register of Overseas Entities it tracks a slightly different thing as well, which is it also deals with beneficial interest, beneficial ownership of property, whereas the RCI deals with the control of land. And so by the time the original recorded person has conveyed the property, has delivered a disposition, they are no longer relevant. So there's no ongoing interest in who had control of land at a particular point in time, rather than still trying to track through who has the beneficial interest in the land or in the proceeds from the sale of land. The other differential between the RCI...
So I don't really understand what you're...
So
as a layperson, I'm just not catching up.
the proposed Register of Overseas Entities looks at beneficial interest in land, which is both control and financial interest in the land, whereas the RCI is about the control of land and transparency, but not necessarily about the financial interest in land. And so when you're looking at control, once a disposition has been delivered and the title is being transferred, that control has gone anyway. There's nothing left that needs to be controlled or understood in relation to that land. Right. And so there's the point of sale and the transfer is less significant in the Register of Controlled Interest than it is in the overseas entities. The other difference is that if you're dealing with an overseas entity, it is very, very clear that you're dealing with an overseas entity. And so there are a lot of transactions that you can simply green flag and say, I do not need to think about this. Whereas the Register of Controlled Interest in land, other than in relation to the exceptions in Part 2, it could apply to potentially every single transaction other than the excluded parties. And so every time you would be faced with buying a property, you would need to go through the process of saying, if I'm not going to get this disposition registered unless this person is a recorded person, if they should be, you then need to retest the recording for every single transaction, which is an administrative burden that would be inefficient, particularly if it's being imposed at the point of sale where there's no longer an ongoing function having the owner recorded on the RCI.
Right.
Sorry.
No, I get it.
Alan Cook wanted to come in.
Yeah, just a couple of comments on, well, first of all, on the level of fines that you'd asked about. In terms, I don't think it's necessarily correct to view the level of fines for this by reference to the level of fines for other things. I completely agree that transparency is the overall purpose of this register and of other registers, but it's transparency for different purposes. And I don't want to detract at all from the importance of transparency in relation to land ownership. Don't get me wrong about that. But at the same time, I think when you're dealing with global money laundering and financial crimes, I don't think you can compare the two as a sort of straight read across. I think that the sort of, if you're determined to, if you're determined not to comply, then I don't think the level of fine is going to make the slightest bit of difference to you. It does take us in as well to the nervousness that we've got, which has already been mentioned, about the sort of automatic criminalisation of people who are inadvertently complying just because they've just not realised that they've got a responsibility. One of the suggestions that we have proposed, and it's not a feature of the regulations unfortunately, is that before the criminality is triggered, that there should be some sort of notice served on the person that gives them warning that they may have failed to comply with the regulations, and that not responding to that would be a criminal act. And again, if you compare this to, for example, LBTT, it's tax compliance. Not submitting an LBTT return does not automatically result in a criminal act, even though you're talking about tax compliance, which is extremely important. The criminality comes in if you have a level of sort of fraudulent evasion and much more serious elements of it, rather than just a sort of automatic aspect to it. So we're concerned about the automatic criminality being introduced here.
Tackled in the revisions to the regulations so far? Is that what did come
It's still
quite early?
it's still automatic.
Yeah,
And that's
right,
the problem.
okay. Finlay, you wanted to ask.
So I just wanted clarity. The committee previously recommended the completion of the register was a precondition for undertaking other administrative and financial changes or transactions relating to land, which should, we thought, give more clarity to who's responsible for the registration. Am I right in saying that, Mr Sinclair, you suggested that was going to be overburdensome, or have I got the wrong end of the stick?
Yes. We think it,
Yes, I've got the wrong end of the stick. It's going to be overburdensome.
Yes, we consider it would be overburdensome.
Right, okay.
Particularly in relation to dealing with third parties for value, whether that's a security or a disposition.
I do apologise.
Sorry, no.
I'm just going to add, in relation to, I'll let you come in, but just in the sort of, perhaps in the sort of more legalistic side of it as well, I'd agree that we'd be very nervous about introducing that sort of requirement for compliance before you're able to sell the land, for example, or to deal with the land. I think if there was ever a minding to introduce that into regulations, I don't think it's something that you could just kind of throw in there. It's something that that needs a lot of care and thought put into it. So, if you look at where it's a feature of the proposed UK regulations on beneficial ownerships of overseas entities, that has been a whole part of the consultation that's been ongoing in relation to that, and the sort of representations that the likes of the Law Society have made into it. So it would take a lot. It would be really important to take care on that, because you're going to start messing up people's ability to get good title, the way that the land registration system works, and things like that.
Okay.
Actually, I was going to broadly echo part of that point, which is around the kind of monitoring of the implementation of the regulations as well, and if not now, then certainly something to consider and actually bottom out in terms of all of the implications of taking this kind of approach, if it is a kind of prerequisite in relation to what the benefits and clearly potential challenges might be in relation to that. So it's certainly something that might be considered at the very least, I would have thought.
Okay, got questions from Mark Ruskell on this and
outstanding
themes.
Yeah, I think, Convener, we've had a good discussion about preconditions, but the only thing I would add in is just a question about whether there are certain administrative or financial changes that would be easier to create a precondition of registration around than others. So we mentioned, sale of land, for example, and you've articulated what the challenges may be around that. I'm wondering if there's an element where preconditionality could be introduced, and then, as Dr. McLeod was saying, then monitor that and seek to extend it, because ultimately this is about power relationships in relation to land, controlling interests. If I was buying a piece of land, I'd want to know what all those relationships were.
Without any making claim for originality whatsoever, I would merely reiterate the points that are made in Global Witness's written submission with regard to the suggestions they have in that regard, which are around when mortgaging or remortgaging the property, other changes to the title deeds of the property. So, yeah, I mean, there are potential areas there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the principle of this kind of cross-compliance approach is pretty sound, I mean, and fundamental to the kind of responsibilities that go with land ownership. So, but equally, I can quite understand the risks in terms of kind of immediate adoption at this point. So I suggest it's certainly something that should be looked at in the early phase of introducing the register. As I understand it, part of the driver, part of the motivation behind looking at this is in terms of compliance and ensuring compliance. So it seems to me that we perhaps should build in this kind of thinking to the monitoring and review process and be ready to do that analysis actually of where the most appropriate, most effective leverage points in terms of cross-compliance might be.
John Sinclair.
The reference to administrative actions on the register, there are very few things that get registered that don't involve two parties. And so for every registration, for every action on the register, unless it is something like a discharge of sound security where the second party has no ongoing interest, the second party will always have an interest in knowing that that deed is registered. The other thing to remember is that the registration is not an instant process, that it's a process that takes place over time and always will take at least some time to register. If there is a requirement that at a particular point in time, the recorded party is fully recorded on the register, then you simply create a degree of uncertainty. That it's very, very difficult for a purchaser to know that the recorded person has complied with their obligations to register. And so you're left with a situation where for a classic sale transaction, when you pay your money and get your disposition, you want to know that there are no barriers between you having paid your money and you having received real title to your property. If you bring in a condition that you only get title to your property if the recorded person is fully and properly recorded in the register along with all of their associates, then it is hard to see how you will ever be 100% sure that that person is fully recorded. Where the recording is based upon trust documentation and documentation that you can test, or voting rights that you can test, you can almost get to a position where you can bank the documentation to ensure that there is compliance.
For something on a person that you have no control over, is that effectively the issue here? Or is it just a case of like people just wouldn't even go there?
Basically, yes. Or the other way of putting it is that the person who bears the cost and the risk of non-compliance isn't the non-compliant person.
Right.
They've just received their money.
It does seem to be a requirement for some kind of gate checking process here. So, I mean, I would expect a lawyer to do this as part of due diligence now, to look at the register of controlling interest and to at least make me, if I was to purchase a piece of land, aware of that. I mean, obviously I could do that myself, but surely this is an important part now. It will become an important part of land transaction in Scotland and
so
transparency.
I can test that the person that I'm contracting with is the registered owner of the land. I can test that the disposition that is presented is signed, and what I can't test is whether the person who has sold it to me has a contract or even an arrangement which is defined in the context or has expanded guidance in the schedule relating to overseas entities, but not in relation to individuals. So it's a contract. I understand that. I'm a lawyer. I know what a contract is. An arrangement which is not a contract, I'm not sure about. There's expanded guidance on what an arrangement is in terms of the overseas entities, but not in relation to an individual. And so can I test what's an arrangement? Can I test if in terms of that arrangement there is control or significant influence? The answer is no, I can't. I have no objective way of testing that. And so if my ability it means I would not then be able to turn around and say to a client, here, I can guarantee that this disposition will give you title. If there is a break or a sort of a cut-off between, or if you cannot then register that disposition because the seller was not fully registered under the RCI.
Okay.
Just to move on to access to the
Yeah.
register, because we are running out of time.
It's really the last question of the session. And it is about ScotLIS. I think we've had some views already about how this may function my understanding is it incorporates 20 separate registers. I'm just thinking about it in terms of a potential user. How can this data be used in that open data format? I mean, for example, if I wanted to look at, say, the Stirling area, and I wanted to identify an individual who either owns parcels of land or has a controlling interest, maybe an options agreement with another family company on other areas of land within that area, will I be able to sort of go on, find out the person's unique identifying number, and then search for that unique identifying number, and it will come up with little parcels of land where I can actually see where their sort of monopoly interest may lie? Is that how this will function? Will the various databases and registers operate seamlessly so that I can see both ownership and controlling interest as well?
I think it would be nice to think that it would work that way.
Right.
Scotland is a good resource. It works well, and it is an accessible, a really good resource for people to access information in its broadest sense. I think the use, for example, of unique identifiers of associates will help that searching process by allowing you to, at the moment under the Land Register, you can do some degree of searching of names to see what properties that named person then owns. And I think I'd have thought that it would be quite achievable that a similar search process could be done in respect of associates that have been registered as opposed to the named owner on the title deeds of the land. So I think sort of just cutting the searching in different ways ought to be something, I think that would be ought to be capable of being achieved. And Scotland being, as John said, a sort of good intuitive system, I think, there's every expectation that the searchability of the RCI would be a similarly intuitive and accessible system.
Yep, Hamish Trench.
I mean, I think, to be honest, only the Keeper and Registers colleagues will be able to say exactly what's possible immediately, but certainly we would strongly support the use of Scotland as the way into the system, so almost regardless of the databases underneath, we would strongly support working towards Scotland being the entry layer that draws these things together. I would agree the search functions are clearly the critical function of that, and I would fully expect that this is going to be something that needs to develop over the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Will the ongoing use of...
Sorry, Dr McLeod wanted to come in, Mark.
No, sorry, I'm quite happy to... Well, sorry, no, thank you, thanks. As Hamish has said, I guess there are very few people who know at the moment how it will work in practice, but clearly, yes, of course, it should be the entry point in relation to people accessing that information. I mean, I have to say, I'm not sure what the state of Scotland is at the moment, but in the past, certainly, it has been criticised in terms of its usability and its kind of flexibility in that sense. I think Andy Whiteman, for one, has been quite critical in relation to that. So it has to be user-friendly and accessible, of course.
Mm-hmm. You got one final question, Mark? Or
No,
are you
that's
quite
okay.
satisfied with that? I want to give you the opportunity to maybe, if there's anything that you feel that you want to say here today, before we do speak to the Keeper in the next part of this session. But also, Finn Carson has something he'd like to put to you as well.
Just something we touched on regarding skill sets with various processes. The Scottish Government have stated they've got no concerns in relation to the capacity of the Register of Scotland, the Lands Tribunal for Scotland and Police Scotland when it comes to establishing the RCI, but also the management of missions, inaccuracies and so on. Do you have any concerns over the capacity and skill sets in place at the moment going forward?
What you're asking people to do. Again, if what you're asking, for example, if you're asking the Registers of Scotland to verify whether it's correct that there ought to be an associate declared in relation to land or whether it's the correct associate, the only way to verify that, either you just write to the person and ask them to confirm, is it really you, and take it at face value, or you dig into the underlying information. And as soon as you dig into the underlying information, you're opening a whole world of of legalistic documentation and corporate structures and offshore arrangements and all sorts of things potentially, which is not, I don't think, what the Registers of Scotland does at the moment. Police Scotland wants to talk, I have no sort of particular knowledge of Police Scotland other than to know that, yes, they would concern themselves with financial crimes, and this is almost sort of getting into the realms of financial crimes, and again, quite a sort of quite a difficult skill set, or a specialised skill set. I think Police Scotland would have to speak to the extent to which they were had the capability and the resource, and both of those things are important from their perspective, from the Register's perspective. Bearing in mind that this is, they're going to have to, nobody pays to register or to access the register, so this is going to have to be funded from some internal resource, the resourcing will have to be mindful, and the expectations of the registers, for example, will have to be mindful of that.
Bringing it back to the regulations, we have actually gone over our time, but is there anything outstanding that you'd like to flag up to us as still being an ongoing concern with the regulations as they're drafted at the moment? We have covered quite a lot this morning, so if there is nothing else, we'll bring it to a close. Thank you very much for your time this morning. We're going to suspend briefly to allow a change in our panel. So welcome back. We continue to take evidence on the proposed draft regulations to establish a register of persons holding a controlled interest in land. And I would like to welcome the keeper of the register, Jennifer Henson. Jennifer, you have been in the gallery for that last session, and I imagine that listening with great interest to some of the reflections that our colleagues have had. I'd like to address one, first of all, around the access to the register and the ease of access to the register and what you're... We've asked you questions on this before, and we know that you intend for the register to sit in the ScotList system and it to be easy to access. Would you like to reflect on any of the comments that have been made around this in the previous panel?
Oh, thank you, Convener. Well, I'd start by saying ScotList is distinctly improved in the last year. We've released a public version that allows the public to search by map and access title information directly. So I think some of the previous criticisms of ScotList we've very much overcome, and we've got very used to responding to the public's feedback about how to improve that system. I think in relation to building the Register of Controlled Interests, we will always go through the Scottish Government's digital first approach, where we work with users, both people who will need to put information in and people who will want to get information out, and we will design a system that works for them. It is certainly our anticipation at the moment that ScotList looks like the logical place to put that. So the way ScotList works at the moment is different land-based registers appear as a layer on ScotList. So you sort of click a box and it says, show me where there are register of controlled interest entries, show me where there are land register entries, and so on. So that would seem to be the logical place where someone would be able to go and search by a piece of land, but obviously the regulations make provision for me to also allow searching in other ways. What's the name of the person you're interested in? What might be the URN, and so on. So the user testing will build all of that, and we would endeavour to make a system that is as intuitive to use as possible. Responding to the point about very much has got to be for lay people to be able to use, particularly for putting information in. We would recognise there's a real spectrum of people who are going to need to submit information to this register, so we wouldn't want people to have a particular professional expertise to understand what to put in, and we will use a test and develop on that basis. And in terms of getting information out, similarly, if you're someone in the street who wants to know about a piece of land up the road, you want to be able to access the Register of Controlling Interest in a very easy and intuitive way, find the information you need, and be able to do what you need to do in terms of following up and contacting the relevant people. And that is what we will aim to build as we go forward with building the system.
There's other access issues as well, and that's cost. Have you reflected on some of the comments that we've had in the past over this process about that ease of access in terms of cost?
Yeah,
particularly yes. if your search leads you on to another register, which they might have a cost associated with it.
So worth obviously setting out very clearly at the moment there are no plans for there to be a fee to either submit information for the Register of Controlled Interests or to get information out. It is true that at the moment for accessing information on the land register, there is a fee. So again, it's one of the improvements we brought in the last year. If a piece of land is on the land register, the public now only have to pay £3 to download the title sheet for that, which is a huge reduction from £30 when they used to have to ring up our customer services. I think the committee will also be aware not all the land in Scotland is yet on the land register, and it is more complex if the land is held in the Sazine register, where the public do still come to us to ask us to dig out the ownership information, and there is a higher fee, £16 plus VAT for that. But obviously we are in the process of aiming by 2024 to get all the land onto the land register. I'd also say it's within the gift of ministers and parliament. They set our fees for access to information, so that is something that if ministers and parliament wish to consider, they would do so in consultation with me to change the price of accessing land register and Sazine register information.
Any questions on that?
You mentioned, it wasn't a question I was going to ask, but my ears just pricked up when you said it may be you're able to search the register for someone's name. How closely are you going to look at the principal reason for setting up the database? I would be concerned if the general public or a newspaper or whatever was able to search for a name of someone and it came up with a whole list of registered ownership where it doesn't, that's really not what it was set up to do. So it could be that a celebrity or a VIP, the Sunday newspapers could search for a name to create a story. Are you aware of the potential unintended consequences of allowing a very broad way to search the information?
So worth saying, I guess, that name searching is something that there is provision made for in the Register of Controlled Interest regulations. So I don't really have an opinion on whether that is appropriate or not. I understand the Information Commission has been consulted about whether there are any reservations. And I think the feeling is that in order to deliver the transparency that the Register of Controlled Interest is intended to deliver, being able to go in and say, I know it's John Smith who's the recorded person, I want to understand who John Smith's associates are, I think you need to be able to provide for John Smith to be searched for, otherwise the register is not delivering the transparency it needs to deliver. We don't currently provide for members of the public name searching on the land register, so you cannot go into ScotList and type in the name of anyone you might be interested and it would tell you where they own their land. Solicitors have access to that functionality precisely because if they're operating for a client, they need to double check they've identified the right information, but quite deliberately it's not something we provide for the public on the land register.
Okay.
Mark, you have questions around the keeper's role.
Yeah, I just wondered if you had any thoughts from the first session around validation, verification, monitoring. You see we had a discussion there about sampling. And there's obviously a concern that, you know, we don't want to overburden you in terms of the kind of investigatory requirements that might be required in some circumstances to get to the bottom of an inappropriately lodged entry or missing entry. But I'm wondering what your views are on that. I mean, what you see as your role, and do you see the role of other bodies or individuals or whoever to be performing some of those functions?
So very clear from the way the regulations are structured at the moment, there is not a duty being placed on me at the outset to verify data. I think I've given evidence before to say I can do a lot to validate that if someone's submitting an address, it's a real address. What I can't do is verify that Joe Bloggs really lives at that address. The regulations make provision that if someone alerts me to the potential of an inaccuracy, I can follow up on that. But I think the evidence that you heard here this morning, I would very rapidly go beyond the competence that we currently have in Registers of Scotland if I was being asked to look at complex company structures and determine what the information. I think the appropriate authorities to investigate those kind of things are the Crown Office, the police, and so on. I think I'd also add, though, we can make it simple for people to notify me of an inaccuracy. So a question came up about how will we know if the register is doing its job. So with all of the systems that we build, we constantly monitor, could you do what you wanted to do today? So we can make it easy for people to tell us, could they find the information they were looking for? We already, with our other registers, have a system of making it easy for people to notify us of an inaccuracy. So it'd be very easy for us to say, if you've got information from the Register of Controlled Interests, you've tried to contact the people, you've not had any joy, you think there might be an inaccuracy, we can make it very simple for people to kickstart the process. As provided, if I was notified of an inaccuracy, I would write to the recorded person, I would ask them to confirm that the information I was holding was indeed correct. If they said it was, that's as far as I would take it. If a third party firmly believed that that person was not providing accurate information, they would need to escalate it to either the Lands Tribunal or to the police for further investigation, and I think those are the appropriate authorities to look into it in more detail. Yeah,
so that's very much a reactive approach to monitoring, but do you see any sort of proactive approach to monitoring? So the suggestion was made around potential sampling, or would you be reliant on that?
I would have the same reservations about the competence. I mean, if the regulation made provision for me to sample a bunch of the records, write out to people, say, are you really who you say you are? Prove to me you're a real associate. if I got anything back and there is nothing in the regulations that would compel people to supply me with the information I'm requesting, I think I'd be very hard-pressed to interpret it. Rightly, the point was made by John Sinclair and Alan that it's not a current skill set we have to undertake that kind of investigatory function. I could hire corporate lawyers and have them on standby to do that kind of investigation, but I don't think it would be a good use of public resources to do that.
Okay.
But it's clearly for Parliament to determine how far they'd like me to take any investigation, and then to the Scottish Government to ensure I'm resourced accordingly to do that.
Okay. What do
Can
you
I
see
bring in
as...
Claudia? Claudia wanted a question on that. Or
It's a follow-up.
it was a follow-up, so Mark, just come back to you and then I'll
Just
take it.
final questions really about what do you see then as effective monitoring? Because we had discussion earlier about monitoring the policy objectives, if you like, but do you see monitoring going beyond that? And if it is just about policy objectives, what do you see as your role within that?
So I think we can certainly build into the system the ability for people to determine whether they've been able to do what they wanted to do. I mean, the most likely use case, I think, is someone who's interested in a piece of land. They want to find out who to talk to in relation to that piece of land. So at a first pass, has our system given them what they need, yes or no? And then have they been able to actually get in contact with the people? And if not, a very straightforward process for them to raise a concern that the register may not be accurate. I mean, I think it's also worth saying for the vast majority of pieces of land, we think there won't be a controlled interest that sits behind it. If you're interested in a piece of land, the land register will take you straight to the owner. There'll be no register of controlled interest entry. You would go straight to the owner to have a conversation. We know that system works very well already. This is an augmenting for where there are people that sit behind the owner providing direction on what they do, and we think we can build a system that allows people to easily get in touch with those people.
Flagged up quite early in the session there that he felt that there might be a gap with the likes of people like asset managers that are maybe, you know, you might not be able to access an asset manager maybe in control of like a pension fund or a trust fund. What's your response to that?
My view is the regulations as defined at the moment provide a reasonably broad definition of who an associate might be. I mean, it's someone who is giving direction or whose direction is usually followed in relation to decisions made on land. And I think if the purpose of this set of regulations is to provide the maximum amount of transparency about who's controlling decisions on land, you want broad people. In the example that Alan gave, if the asset manager is the person who's making recommendations and those recommendations are usually followed, then it will be for the recorded person who owns, I think his example was a shopping centre, to decide would they consider that person to be an associate, and if so, record them appropriately. They'll provide contact details. If someone wanted to get in touch with them, they would then be able to. I mean, I think, if I may add, I think in relation to a number of points were made about, you know, get it up and running and then sort of understand how it works. We'll know quite quickly, I think, whether people have drawn the right boundary around who they consider to be an associate, because if someone gets in touch with the recorded person and their associates to have a conversation about a piece of land, and at that point the recorded person says, oh, hang on a minute, I need to go and also talk to person X to be involved in that discussion, it should put an alarm bell that, well, person X should have been registered as an associate. So I can imagine that we will iterate a little bit in people realising that they should have included someone else who perhaps they hadn't thought of in the first instance, but we won't know that till we get it up and running.
Okay, Claudia.
Thank you, Gavina, and good morning to
Morning.
you. Without wanting to imply that I think a lot more should be done by the keeper in terms of monitoring, and I've taken on board the concerns about things being onerous and costly and those aspects. Really building on the discussion that we've had already about this today and previously, would you see that there is a role to have a power to actually monitor and review after a certain period of time how the new register is actually working in terms of the policy intent of transparency, and if so, how often do you think that should happen?
So I
And
certainly
by whom, perhaps?
So I certainly think with any policy that's coming in, monitoring that it's working and adjusting if required through regulation updates are valuable. I think there are various parties that will have a part to play in that. I can certainly monitor the use of the system, that it's effective, that people can find the information they need, and I can do that on a day-to-day basis. I can track how many security declarations I'm getting, how many notifications of inaccuracy. We can monitor all of that very easily, and I think that's the sort of data that will tell you is the process and the policy intent being delivered. By way of an extreme example, if every single person who goes on the register and then tries to contact the people who've been recorded as recorded people or associates gets no response, then clearly we would, and notifies me that there's an inaccuracy and my follow-up gets no response, that's an extreme of us saying, well, it's clearly not working. If actually almost every time someone tries to get hold of the people, they get a response, they get a constructive discussion, then we would say broadly the policy intent is working, and then I think we would potentially need to look at, okay, what else might we need to do to follow up on the small number of cases that it aren't working. And the sanctions are already there. I mean, investigating criminal prosecution if necessary for people who fail to comply. And I think you'd need to follow those through. I think the regulations make good provision to encourage people to apply and provide sanction if they don't.
And do you think there should actually be a duty to collate information and data and report that in the public domain or not?
I think if...
I mean, you've explained it very clearly that you intend to do it, so don't misunderstand what I'm asking.
It's always helpful for there to be clarity around duties. So if the committee wished to be really clear about what monitoring they wish to be done about the use of the information, I think it's probably helpful if that's put in the regulations. But it's good practice anyway when you build a system to ensure it's actually working. And I'm sure Scottish Government colleagues have plans to make sure they're monitoring the effectiveness of the regulations when they come in.
Thank you.
You've mentioned that you're testing it at the moment. Going through user testing. But I would like to ask you for more detail on what you're going to be doing once it's up and running to absolutely publicise the tool and let people know what they have to do in relation to registering their own controlled interest?
So I think importantly, convener, that has to start well before the tool's up and running. So I think we're obviously not wanting to preempt parliamentary process and want to wait till we've got the final version of the regulations before we start publicising very widely. But we'll be working closely with Scottish Government colleagues to make sure that everybody who should be caught by these regulations knows what they need to do, when they need to do it, and how they need to do it. I think we're fortunate from a Registers of Scotland perspective. We're well connected across the country, across the communities of people, lawyers, accountants, that sort of thing, who are likely in a lot of cases to be people advising people. We've got a good social media presence. We've got conferences that we run around the country. So I think we can work very much to support Scottish Government to publicise that this is coming and what people will need to do. I think the other opportunity is, as we start to develop the system, the user testing itself will do a lot to raise awareness. We'll be out calling for volunteers to be part of the designing of the system, and we will make sure that in doing that, we're accessing the most representative type of user. So we would hope that that would spread the word quite effectively around the different communities of people, that this thing is coming and people will want to be on board with making sure it's well designed and meets their needs. So yeah, we will do everything we can. And then, one of the things I welcome in the updated regulations is the extended transition period. So we publicise as much as we can before April 21 when this is planned to come in, but people then have all the way through to April 22 to actually comply. So we would continue to publicise extensively once it's up and running and be making sure we're monitoring, how much use is it getting and things like that.
Okay. Finlay, do you have some questions?
I think you've covered most of what I was going to ask. It was about the sort of difference between verification and validation, and whether there was a need for a validation, if you like, in the very, very most basic sense. And you touched on that you think it's probably just going to be done once the system's up and running. I would quite like to have seen a sample, as Mark Ruskell has mentioned, or or some process which you, as the register, sent out a simple notification to say this is the information we've got, to make sure in practice people are responding within the right time and so on, because that's what we want. We want someone that at the end of that letter trail, someone at the address that's going to respond in a timely manner. I would like to have seen some sort of validation of the data you had on that basis. But from what you're saying, you're confident that just the public using it from day one will give you some indication whether the system's working.
The thing I'd highlight in the regulations, the primary onus is on the recorded person to submit the details of their associates, but the regulations very clearly also place a duty on the associate that if they are aware they are an associate of someone and they haven't been told that they've been added on to the Register of Controlling Interests, they're supposed to do something about it. So I think you've got a fail-safe there as well to say, if someone has submitted information, a recorded person has submitted information and they've missed someone off, that person, if we do the job we want to do on the publicity campaign, will say, hang on, I was expecting to be added on to this thing. I'm going to get hold of the recorded person and ask them to submit their information. So I think we have enough people checking. And then, as I say, once it's up and running and people start to try and use it, I think that will quite rapidly establish whether the information there is correct. And if not, the follow-up and sanctions are clear in the regulations, I think.
There's a couple of things mentioned around the security declaration in the previous panel. I've written a couple of notes here about concerns about the hard cut-off point. And also there was an issue about the person having one of their other associates knowing that they would have a security declaration, maybe some of the kind of sensitivities around that. Would you like to respond to some of the comments that were made on that?
On the hard cut-off, I think you need a cut-off. Otherwise, you have an endless cycle of people saying, oh, hang on a minute, I'll get you the evidence. I mean, I think 60 days feels long enough for the recorded person submits the information, they tell their associates they've done it. If any of the associates say, oh, I feel I need to put a security declaration in, given the gravity of why you would want to be putting a security declaration in, you'd be getting that in pretty quick. And if it needed to be followed up with, there's a very comprehensive list of evidence that people can provide to back up why they need a security declaration. I think 60 days is a more than adequate amount of time for people to supply that. The regulations make provision for me to consider things out with the set of evidence. So again, I think if you were in the very unlikely case where you're an associate who can't get your hands on any of the list of evidence, I think you would write to me and explain why not and explain what alternative evidence you're offering. And so it feels to me like 60 days is a perfectly adequate amount of time for that to happen. Otherwise, I think you just end up with a very open-ended process where we would have pending security declarations potentially indefinitely. I don't think I can comment on in detail on the question about, and I would need to go back into the regulations, but the notifying the recorded, if you're an associate and you're notifying your recorded person that you are having a security declaration, I'm not sure you have to send all the detail. I'd have to check, but I'm not sure you have to do anything other than tell them you're submitting a security declaration. I don't know that you have to go into all the details on that, but I would check, and I think that would be something for Scottish Government colleagues to look at if there's a concern that if the regulations as written mean that you have to expose the details of your security declaration to your recorded person, and that in itself might cause a problem. That would be something I think Scottish Government officials would need to look at whether they can tweak on that.
Certainly the discussions with you previously and just now, I'm getting the fact that around the sensitivities around here, a lot of the arrangements around it are, there's an open door policy from yourself and it's at your discretion that, you know, if there's any sensitivities that you are available in order to manage the sensitivities around that.
Yeah, and I think the regulations make provision, the line that is, and any other evidence I may consider appropriate. I would not want to be in the position of exposing the details of someone who has a valid reason for a security declaration without having gone through the appropriate process. I think the other thing worth saying is in the regulations, there is then an appeal process and a standstill. So if I go back to someone and say, well, I'm very sorry, you say you'd like a security declaration, you either haven't provided me with sufficient evidence or I haven't seen the evidence that I need to see, they can appeal that decision, and whilst that appeal is going through, their details are still withheld from the register. And so I think, again, there's another mechanism to make sure that no one's going on the register when they shouldn't be in relation to security.
Okay. And my colleagues get any further questions? Yes.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Just in practice, the other databases you've got, as you've touched on, there's still some land registry information held on the Register of Cesines that is yet to be transferred. Are we likely to see a RCI that's completely populated online the day we start, or is it going to be something that there'll be entries that say this is to be updated or refer to something else? How's it going to work in practice?
So it's a great question that we've thought through about what will we do about land that is currently still on the Cesine register, because one of the things we most definitely want, the regulations for RCI make provision for a description of the land as I define in the application. Our experience is Cesine's descriptions are sometimes quite hard to interpret. So one of the things we're looking at, and again this will be part of user testing, is when the recorded person is submitting the information, if it's a piece of Cesine land, they could supply a written definition, but we're also looking at providing a really simple mapping tool where people could just click on the map and go, and it's that bit of land there that I'm talking about. So then it will make no difference when people are searching the RCI. They will be able to look at a map and they will be able to say, that's the bit of land I'm interested in, and it will be invisible to them whether it's a Cesine title or a land register title. It'll be easy for land register titles because there'll be a title number and people will just be able to quote that, but we have already started to think through how can we make it as accessible as possible for people if they know the bit of land they're interested in. What's helpful actually is having released the ScotList public version, we've already released a very simple draw on the map tool so that when the public are interested in a title that's not on the land register, they draw on the map and send it in to us and say, could you look in the Cesine register for this? In this example, they'd draw on the map and it would say, yes, there is an RCI entry for that. We'll surface it for you now. So I think all of that we will clearly flesh out in user testing, but we think we've thought through a fairly elegant solution to that.
Just on that response, we understand that the register is going to be free at the point of access. However, as you've laid out, there will be some of the information that people request that's not on the RCI initially. It will actually be on the Register of Cesines, or it will be in some other database where currently there is a charge for accessing that data. How are you going to get through that issue where it might be free, but it's actually in another database it might not be? How are you going to work with that in practice?
So I should be really, I think I should be really clear. If there's a controlled interest in the land, you will get everything you need to know from the RCI, and that will be completely clear. So you'd go into the system. Let's say you know what the piece of land is. You'd click on the map. The system would say, yes, there is an RCI entry for that. Here's the recorded person and their address. Here's all the associates and their address, and you'd have what you need to go away. If you went into the system and said, that's the bit of land I'm interested in, it might say, well, there's no RCI entry for that, therefore there isn't a controlled interest, there isn't a recorded person, there isn't associates. What you need is the ownership information, and then you'd be into our normal system, which, as I said a moment ago, yes, we do charge for providing people with the basic ownership information, but if there was an RCI entry, you wouldn't need to go into that for either stuff on the Cesine register or the land register to get the information you need.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mark?
Do you think there's a link between the level of sanction that's being applied through these regulations and the accuracy of the register?
I think that the sanction of a criminal record for non-compliance is a pretty significant sanction, and I think the vast majority of people will not want to criminalise themselves by not complying and providing the information. I appreciate there's been some discussion about the level of the fine. That's not something I can really comment on, but I think much more significant is the fact you get a criminal record if you don't comply would put most people off not complying, I think the register will be accurate. I note Companies House, with their persons of significant control, think they have 98% compliance in terms of people submitting information. So I think, you know, that's the sort of levels plus that we should be aspiring to with this.
And are you content that there are provisions in place for the people who genuinely made a mistake? You know, they genuinely have maybe not responded for whatever reason, that there's sufficient leeway in there to not criminalise genuine people who might have no malicious or no intent other than the fact that.
So I think to the letter of the regulations as written, there isn't. You would, once you have not complied, you would technically be guilty of having committed an offence. I noticed the Scottish Property Federation suggested potentially a sort of two-stage process where if we become aware there's an omission, we notify you. If you comply, that's the end of it. I think if the committee wished, potentially that provision could be made in the regulations if you wanted to be really sure. I think it would be a question for Police Scotland and the Crown Office to what extent they would be interested in following through on any kind of criminal sanction if at the very beginning of their investigation someone said, oh blimey, sorry, didn't mean to have missed that out, I'll get it sent in immediately. I'd be highly surprised if at that point they wanted to press on, but it's not something clearly for me to be able to give an opinion on in detail.
Okay. Are my colleagues satisfied that they have heard everything they need to hear? I want to thank you very much for your attendance today. I'm going to suspend this meeting briefly. We're actually going to clear the gallery for about 5 or 10 minutes. If people can, we will be starting up in public session again, but we do need to have a bit of a chat ahead of that. Welcome back. We're continuing, our fourth item. We're on to a new item today. Sorry, I was looking at the wrong part of my notes. Fourth item today is a roundtable evidence session on the draft regulations to establish a right to buy land to further sustainable development. And we have got a rather large panel today. It's a round table, not as formal quite as an evidence session. So we've been able to invite a lot of guests. 10 people giving evidence in this session. With that in mind, I'd like to remind witnesses their microphones are controlled by broadcasting, so you don't have to press any buttons or anything, it's all done for you. If you want to make a point, whatever, the best way to do it is just to raise your finger in the air, and myself and my clerks will make a little list and we will get round to you. I'll make a list and try and that goes for members as well when they want to ask any questions or intervene at any point. I'd like to begin by introducing myself, and then we'll go round the table from myself onwards. Clerks won't make mention. My clerk and team will just stay in the background as they do so beautifully. And if you could just indicate who you are and who you're representing, if anyone. So I'm the convener, Gillian Martin.
I'm Malcolm Coombe from the University of Strathclyde.
I'm Rachel Oliphant from Pinsent Masons LLP, representing the Scottish Property Federation.
Annie Wells, MSP for Glasgow.
Gemma Cooper, National Farmers Union.
Sandra Holmes, Highlands and Islands Enterprise.
Mark Ruskell, MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife.
Hamish Trench, Scottish Land Commission.
John Hollingdale, Community Woodlands Association.
Annie McKee from the James Hutton Institute.
Callum MacLeod, Community Land Scotland.
I'm Claudia Beamish, and I'm MSP for South Scotland and Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Climate Change, Environment and Land Reform.
I'm Gavin Mowat. I'm here for Scottish Land and Estates.
Dermot Terns, National Trust for Scotland.
Fiona Carson, MSP for Galloway and Western Fries.
Okay, so I'd like to start things off by talking about the consultation process. I've got the consultation documents in front of me and just ask how content you've been with that process, and do you feel that the views that you and concerns that you might have put forward have been taken into account? Who would like to go first? It's always that tricky moment before everyone wants to come in. Gemma.
Yeah, I would say that we're really content with the process that's been undertaken. Scottish Government has been really good to deal with in this process, and they've looked at pre-existing legislation, taken a lot from that, and I think we're fairly content with where the majority of things are, because they've taken quite a pragmatic approach.
Because this is the last right to buy piece in the jigsaw, isn't it? So do you feel your concerns have been addressed around that gap?
Yes, I would agree that we felt we were well consulted, and that the the Community Land team engaged with us as well beforehand, particularly with the abandoned, neglected or detrimental land, and took into account our concerns about making sure that the prohibition on sale only kicked in once the notice appeared in the register of applications by community bodies to buy land, which makes it a lot easier for our members when they're dealing with land to know when the prohibition starts. So, yeah, we were grateful.
Any other reflections on Callum?
Yes, I mean, I think we'd very much echo those comments from Community Land Scotland's perspective. Scottish Government officials have been excellent in terms of the level of communication and the opportunities to input our views into that whole process. So, as you say, convener, an important part in the jigsaw with regard to the community rights to buy, in that sense.
Yes, Gavin.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think we're absolutely of the same opinion, that we welcomed what the Scottish Government had done in terms of engagement and drawing from their previous legislation, including the abandoned, neglected part, which we quite welcome the fact that a lot of what has been drawn on from that experience has come into this regulation.
In terms of the definition around sustainable development, I mean, are you content that that is nailed down enough so that if you have got a situation where people are wanting to apply for this, that they know what it is that they have to do in order to actually fulfil the criteria around sustainable development? Yes.
One of our concerns that wasn't defined in the Act itself, and it's not in the text of the regulation either, And I think it's a bit of a challenge for both applicants and for owners as to what the test actually is. And there are good international definitions of it, so it'd be good maybe to get some, pending text to say what Scottish Government expects to mean by sustainable development.
So almost sort of like guidance around that and maybe some case examples. Malcolm?
Yeah, this has been sort of with sustainable development, it's been a recurring theme since the 2003 legislation in terms of part 2 and part 3 of that. And the difficulty with definitions is definitions can trap you as well as be useful, and there are many sectors. So for example, in the insurance sector, to just give you a strange example, they don't actually define what an insurance contract is, because as soon as you do, you'll get people trying to sort of make sure they're not within that definition, because that allows you to work around it and exclude yourself from regulation, for example. So it is a problem. Of course it's a problem, but I think it's been recognised as a problem in previous turns of the legislation. The question is now the time to try and do something about it? And some people would argue we are where we are. It's maybe having not done anything in relation to the previous 3 community rights to buy would be quite incongruous to suddenly do something about it now and try and capture it in a form of wording which might leave some people dissatisfied. It's just, it's a prickly issue. It's tough.
And who's going to be the arbiter of whether or not someone actually conforms to this, as you say, undefined phrase? Rachel, you wanted to come in.
Yes, just to say, I agree that wouldn't be helpful to now try and define it in legislation, but that more detailed guidance would be very welcome, and examples of what would fall within that definition.
Hamish, you wanted to come in next.
I appreciate it's always tempting to try and define, but I think it's probably quite risky to try and define this within legislation. It seems to me that sustainable development and indeed the public interest is likely to shift over time. And given how important and fundamental this right to buy is, it needs to be able to reflect changing circumstances. So to me, it's something that guidance, sufficient clarity in terms of the considerations within the regulations, but then guidance that can change over time.
John?
I think it's going to have to be sort of judged on a case-by-case basis, because you can't define which activities or which piece of land beforehand, before you know what's coming forward. I mean, we'd probably all agree that Scotland needs more affordable housing, and that provision of affordable housing would further sustainable development, but probably not on St Kilda or the top of the Cairngorm Plateau or lots of other places. And I think it has to be in that case-by-case basis. If you try and judge it before you actually get real applications with real proposals, then, as you say, you trap yourself.
Yeah, to come back to Malcolm's point, people will be excluded by something that's not been really intentional. Callum?
Annie had a...
Oh, Annie.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I would agree with all the points made so far, and I suppose the opportunity is here for communities to take forward something very innovative. So we want to open the opportunity and be flexible in how we identify and understand sustainable development. But that has to be a conversation at the local level, and I suppose with ministers, and so definitely further guidance would be helpful, and worked case studies.
Yeah. Callum.
I think one of the issues with sustainable development, and I say that as somebody taught a number of courses on sustainable development at the University of Edinburgh, where you could have a 3-day conference on the meaning of it, is that it is just that wide-ranging in terms of its parameters. So to actually have a statutory definition of it is, for the reasons that other colleagues have said, I think unhelpful in terms of the intent of legislation in that sense, and the kind of public interest as being the overarching determinant of how sustainable development is interpreted and implemented in practice is fundamentally important in relation to that. And I think the regulations and the Act does do that. Does a good job in terms of giving some parameters with regard to that in terms of economic regeneration and the other criteria as well. And that kind of case-by-case element of interpretation then allows for the public interest and the common good as concepts to be actually moved from the policy intent to the practicalities of implementing and interpreting this right to buy in practice.
Dermot, you wanted to come in.
I was just going to add that the Scottish Government's already a signatory to the UK Shared Framework on Sustainable Development, which gives quite a lengthy description of what sustainable development constitutes. So there is already accepted what the definition of it is. And then the 2019 Planning Act, we also actually put a purpose in for the first time for planning, which included sustainable development and defined in terms of long-term public interest. So I think we're kind of moving to being clearer about how we're working towards the future. It's not just a kind of short-term fix, that we're actually trying to define these things and what they mean practically. So it'd be good to see kind of clear definition, I think.
Finlay, you wanted to come in and ask.
An example, and I would like to find out where you think this is an example that would fit into sustainability. A community of 30 houses in the middle of a wood, long way from everywhere. Social landlord decides to put 4 of the houses on the market because they can't afford to put them up to the new insulation standards. The community wants to buy them to stop Airbnb people buying them and affect the number of children going to the local school or something. Does that fit the criteria for this when it comes to sustainability of a community?
Yes, I would suggest
Sandra.
it would. I think it has to be looked at in the context of the situation. So if you've got quite a small community that's potentially going to be losing people from that community, the impact it has on wider service provision is quite significant. And that this is where I think sustainable development, you can't pin it down. It has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis in the context of where that community is operating. The other thing, community buyout projects are so diverse. It could be a small building plot up to buying a whole island, a whole estate, getting a definition that would encompass and reflect appropriately all those considerations. You'd be writing chapters. I think the other thing, as Malcolm mentioned, is sustainable development is consistent since the initial community right to buy and the Crofton community right to buy, and I'm not aware of any challenges to the definition or any problems it's created in practice, and there's been quite a number of community right to buy applications have gone through the process successfully.
Callum.
You were saying that this hypothetical community is a long way from everywhere. It's close to somewhere, though, isn't it, in terms of where communities might be? And I think that is a critical point as well in terms of what we're looking for in terms of policy intention. If we're looking for, and we'll probably touch on this later on, but quite fragile, remote rural communities to actually sustain themselves and be developed sustainably, then clearly, as Sandra says, access to services, access critically to housing and affordable housing is very, very important in terms of being the lifeblood of that community. So when we're thinking about sustainable development, we are talking in these different elements of social, economic and cultural and environmental, I think.
John.
I'd agree with what colleagues said, but also I think if I have right in your example, you were saying the landlord was putting them up for sale, whereas actually this particular part would only be in the circumstance where the landlord kind of refused to sell and refused to do anything positive and was not helping. And so in that situation, I think it'd be very much clearer that it would be furthering sustainable development for the community to take on those houses that weren't being brought up to spec.
Malcolm.
Yeah, it was just to sort of flag that in the example you gave, there might actually be an existing device in Scots law that could have been used to help there in terms of the rural housing burden, if you were to insist on a rural housing burden being imposed in terms of Section 43 of the Title Conditions Act from 2003. So that it would depend on how you could sort of encourage people to constitute a rural housing body and have a burden in favour of them, but it's just a possible alternative to using this legislation. The other thing, if I might just come in and quickly say, Sandra reminded me of something there in terms of sort of existing approaches to community buyouts and what have you. Just being one of the lawyers in the room, I will mention human rights, because obviously the European Convention on Human Rights is hardwired into the Scotland Act 1998, and the existing community rights to buy that have preceded, most notably in the Park litigation that happened up in the east coast of the Isle of Lewis, there was a discussion around human rights, and sustainable development wasn't held in terms of its current non-definition. The lack of a definition wasn't seen as too much of an issue. Obviously, I'm simplifying grossly here, but it wasn't too much of a definition in terms of Article 1 of the first protocol, peaceful enjoyment of possessions, or indeed Article 6 in terms of a landowner getting a fair hearing. So again, if we were to think about doing something with sustainable development now, okay, fine, have that discussion, but it wouldn't necessarily be needed in terms of human rights law as has been interpreted to date in Scotland.
I want to open it up to talk about just how onerous this is to the community's right to buy in order to have a sustainable development project. I mean, it's one of the things that throughout this process of land reform, we've seen that communities have used all the tools available to them in order to gain control of land. It's still quite onerous, though, is the impression that I get in speaking to people in my constituency. I mean, I would like to know your reflections on how this might actually help in that respect. I'll take John, who's had his hand up first.
Thanks. I think there's two sets of levels of where the burden comes in. The first is actually in the Part 5 rules themselves, that they're quite significant tests that the community will have to demonstrate they meet of harm, benefit in the future, and this being the only or most practical way of actually furthering sustainable development. And then there's the kind of process burdens. We think that in order to get to stage 5, community bodies will have had to go through Part 2 of the 2003 Land Reform Act and have an existing kind of community right to buy registration in order to have the prohibition on transfer. Otherwise, it's just too easy to avoid the legislation. There are probably vanishingly small numbers of eligible community bodies at the moment because of the way that this act has been framed. That's not something we can change in the regulations, but there are almost no bodies out there who have the powers in their constitution to use this. So at the first instance, communities are going to have to go and change their constitution in order to be able to use this legislation. Then they're going to have to go through Part 2. Then they're going to have to go through the processes that we have in Part 5. So it is going to be a long journey and probably quite a testing one for community bodies.
Annie?
We did some research for the Scottish Land Commission, actually, my colleague Rob McMorrin and others, including Malcolm and John, which looked at a review of community right to buy mechanisms, and it did evidence how onerous it was, the earlier mechanism. So, as John's mentioned, if you already have to constitute yourself in a certain way and then work through Part 2 to achieve Part 5, it's really relying heavily on community effort and volunteers. So anything that could make that more supported, not necessarily easier, but providing opportunities for facilitated discussion with the landowners or resources to be able to work through these processes from a legal perspective, I think that would be very worthwhile. But I think that it is a good thing if it encourages greater community engagement with the landowning sector.
Yeah. Callum?
Just to say that, yes, it is an onerous process for communities to undertake. Because there isn't a willing seller in these circumstances, so clearly there's a high bar to be set in relation to that, and that's understandable for all sorts of reasons. But it's really important that it's not made too high as well. I mean, 10 years ago I led a post-legislative scrutiny of the Land Reform Act 2003 on behalf of the Parliament, and one of the clear findings from that study was that both Part 2 and especially Part 3, the Crofton Community Right to Buy, was extremely onerous in terms of the demands that were placed upon communities. And we've seen the subsequent changes of the legislation since then. So no one's ever going to get it right first time necessarily, but we really do need to be mindful. I would suggest that we do not make the challenges disproportionately difficult for communities in that sense.
I'll come to Rachel next.
Yeah. So I was going to say, I think this will be very onerous for community bodies, and I actually, in my personal capacity, I live in a community where we did exercise the community right to buy under Part 2, and we were lucky in that our community had within it an architect, an accountant, a lawyer. So we had the people who, and lots of retired people who had the time to put the application together to sort out the funding and subsequently to maintain the property, because we bought in 2008. So we're now a good number of years on. And it's been very successful, so very much appreciate that we had that opportunity. But I can see that it can be very hard for other communities without the resources within the community that we had.
It's a familiar story.
Yeah. But I have to say that that's where the community land team are very helpful in that situation. So yeah, they're there for everybody's.
Hamish.
Yes. When Callum said the first point I was going to make, that inevitably this is a fairly high bar given it's compulsory right, but I also think it's helpful to think about the wider context here. And clearly, if we are collectively going to normalise community ownership, as something that communities right across Scotland is a realistic option, we're not going to do that through rights to buy. That is never going to be the usual way that every community will acquire land and buildings. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the role that the right to buy plays in shifting the dynamic and changing the culture and the nature of the balance of power in discussions, essentially. So I think that is fundamentally important, and our success is probably more about the level of negotiated transfers that takes place. But I would say clearly where it's needed, this has to be usable. This has to be accessible and usable, because it has to be there as a backstop.
So it might actually not happen often, but it's always there if you haven't been able to achieve access through other means. Yeah. Sandra.
Just to build on the point that Hamish is making, I think any community buyout is a long journey. If you're going through the legislation, it's a longer journey, and if you're going through the legislation that involves compulsory purchases, it's an even longer journey. I suppose it's getting that balance of rights appropriate. But I think the fundamental thing is, whilst it is onerous and it is a long journey for communities, it absolutely has to be workable. There's been a crofting community right to buy that's been enacted since 2004, and to date it's never been used to fruition. But it has, through bringing parties together, facilitated a number of crofting estates transferring from private ownership into community ownership. I think it would be great to see a crofting community right to buy be successful, just to prove the legislation works. And likewise with this legislation, I think it's absolutely imperative that it is deemed to be workable in practice, because if not, its presence, I think the presence, as Hamish is saying, it's helpful to have it in the background. It's not the go-to piece of legislation at all. And I work with communities all the time, and we would never say this is your starting point. But bringing the parties together, I think the leverage it can offer is hugely beneficial. And it's fair to say now that we've got all these rights to buys, the vast majority of community purchases happen through negotiation, and that's the right place to be. But we need the legislation to provide that wider framework and backdrop to encourage those facilitated purchases.
So as I said at the start, it is the final piece in the jigsaw, really, but there's the other jigsaw pieces are probably the more go-to. Gemma, you wanted to come in.
No, I agree with the majority of what's been said. I think it is really important to just emphasise that for our members in particular, this does really change the conversation, because we're talking about it as a community right to buy, but it is actually a compulsory purchase. So for our guys, it's potentially quite uncomfortable. I do agree that the hurdles need to be proportionate. I think personally, that, as it is at the moment, I appreciate that they're difficult. But for me, I mean, as my fellow speaker here identified, when a community takes on an asset, it's permanent, it needs to be looked after long term, etc. So I would sort of suggest that actually having high hurdles is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's probably relative to how serious that community is, to look after that asset going forward. And I would also emphasise as well that, as what Hamish said, I don't think that success here is measured on the number of times this is used. Success should be about negotiated transfers without having to use this, but it is obviously going to be a backstop.
Yeah. Rachel, you want to come back in?
Well, you've just actually, Gemma's made the point I was going to make, which is that if the community can't work together to get the application at the application stage, they're not going to be able to maintain the property in the future. So actually, it's good to establish at the outset that they've got the ability to.
Dermot, carry on.
Hamish, I think it's a bit onerous, but it's probably there as a backstop rather than the front stop, as it were. And I think it does change the dynamic, and part of that is actually about what are the options. And for us, charitable landowner, it's not necessarily ownership. It might be leasing something, it might be an alternative site, that it opens up a discussion. So I wouldn't measure it by kind of zero-sum transfer, non-transfer. It might be different ways of doing things. So I think having it as the backstop is quite valuable.
Move on to questions and themes from Mark Ruskell.
I think we've covered.
Right, okay.
Elements. Yeah, I think we can move on.
Finlay.
Yeah, I'm going to move on to a point that has been contentious in the part, but it's about the types of occupancy or possession relating to tenancies. So do the provisions in relation to occupation or tenancies adequately cover all possible eventualities when we're looking at the right to buy? And we'll probably look at Malcolm here with regards to human rights and so on.
Yeah, so I mean, the starting point would be that if you're a sitting tenant, to an extent, you won't be affected by the transfer of your landlord's interest as it is. The one thing that I sort of made a point of saying in the response that was put in while I was working at the University of Aberdeen is the way it's drafted at the moment is it's actually a list that is exhaustive of the list of what tenancies are caught, and query whether it should be a non-exhaustive list, just in case there was something that wasn't quite caught within. It's again the dangers of definitions and trapping yourself in a definition. So as I say, that was my sort of purely drafting concern. But again, just sort of from a tenant's perspective, though, they should not be, for the currency of that lease, directly affected by the transfer of the landlord's interest, at least in law. And obviously there might be a dynamic in terms of a new personality they've got to engage with.
Yeah, I think the very nature of lists, it's what's excluded that you're drawing attention to, not what's included. So when it comes to the definition of the likes of tied accommodation, is that adequately understood and what the implications of that definition might be?
I mean, from my perspective, I would say it is, but I'm saying this from someone who's sort of maybe been swimming in that legislation a bit in relation to the private residential tenancies. I've written a bit about this with Professor Peter Robson from the University of Strathclyde, and there's plenty of case law in relation to the Rent Acts down the years as to what could and could not constitute tied accommodation. It's not something that I'm hugely concerned about in relation to that point. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to come in on that.
Gavin?
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, the definition of tied accommodation is something that, you know, if you're a lawyer, you can understand. If you're a community, I'm not sure that there's that same breadth of understanding. There might be across some communities, there might be some experts in some communities, as we've heard before, but by and large, I'm not sure that it'll be adequately understood across the board. That said, I'm not even sure that that's the main issue that we wanted to bring up. And from our point of view, I think thinking about this whole regulation, the purpose of it is to deliver sustainability. And where this tied accommodation is included in the abandoned and neglected, we can understand, you know, you're trying to fix a problem where there's abandoned and neglected. But for sustainability, if you're taking tied accommodation as a part and rather than the whole of a business and including that in a right to buy, then you must consider the possible implications of sustainability to the wider business. And I think that is something that we need to consider more appropriate, more within this regulation.
Callum, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Commissioner. I mean, I think there's an issue here around community capacity that's been mentioned, and that will vary in different communities, as we know. But what certainly when you see very, very many, I'm sure the vast majority of community buyouts that are being undertaken, what you see is actually an untapping of community capacity in many instances, and you're seeing communities that are actually taking control of the land and other assets as a means of delivering the housing, the jobs, the services that are actually going to ensure that they are sustainable in practice. So the kind of that bottom-up element is really important in that sense. And if we're talking about tied accommodation, quite often you will see, of course, in communities as well that have taken over assets and tracts of land, they've actually delivered or enabled businesses to take place through that new ownership model as well. So there's an important continuity as opposed to a disjuncture there, I think, as well under community ownership.
Okay, I'll go to John and I'll come back to Annie.
So I think when these regulations and these rules more or less cut and pasted across from Part 3A, the abandoned and neglected, and in the discussion when that legislation was going through the Parliament, initially I think there was an idea that all tenancies would be excluded, and it was pointed out quite clearly that if you did that, that would rule out huge areas of Scotland from eligibility. The point with with this and tied accommodation and the broader points that Gavin made is that everything would be subject to that sustainable development test. I suspect a community that came forward and simply wanted to buy or to acquire some houses that were currently tied accommodation with no other purpose would struggle with a sustainable, making a sustainable development test to Scottish ministers. The point is it has to be included, because if what they want to buy is the whole estate, then they want to take the tied accommodation with it or the other forms of tenancy with it. So I think you have to frame it with that broader sustainable development test of why the community body is seeking to acquire the housing that's currently under one of these forms of tenancy and the other bits of land that they want to acquire with it, rather than just looking at the housing, because I think that would be really unlikely that ministers would ever approve such an application.
Annie.
Speaking as a non-lawyer, I suppose I'm just a bit nervous about tied accommodation, because I feel that it possibly reinforces power relations that are quite traditional and maybe a way that we want to move away from that. So I would just encourage that in the guidance document there's consideration of how employment opportunities and housing opportunities are provided in parallel, that if you're offered a job you're also hopefully offered a tenancy that's discrete from your job, and what we need there is more homes, and especially in rural communities.
John, you suggested that much of this was just lifted and dropped from previous legislation. Are there any other provisions in there that are different from other community rights to buy? And if there is there good reason to include them?
There are additional provisions that don't appear in Part 2, but I think in terms of Part 3A and Part 5, and I'm looking at Malcolm because he'll tell me when I've got this wrong, I think most of these provisions are pretty much word for word. Mm-hmm.
Word for word, and I'm just looking back at what I mentioned, a sort of one omission that was perhaps made back when Part 3A regulations were put in place was there was no mention of tenancies at will, which is this particular type of tenancy that exists in some geographic locations in Scotland, not very common, which is possibly a little bit of an oversight. But otherwise, though, yeah, it just tracks what's in the 2018 regulations.
Right, move on to questions from Mark Ruskell this time.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. If I could turn to the exclusions that are within these regulations. So there's the Section 4 exclusions in relation to an individual's residence and the curtilage of that residence. Always think back to the Anglo case around access legislation back in the 2003 Act. But there's also the land that's then ancillary to that person's residence, and there are various exemptions there around keeping pets, recreational leisure, activities, growing of food, etc. Can I just ask for your thoughts on those exclusions and whether they're appropriately drawn? Do you see any issues with those, or things that could be included which aren't included? Is this drawn too broadly or too narrow?
Callum?
I can clearly see why the categories of exclusions have been included in that particular section of the regulations. One of the points that we made, I think others probably did as well, in relation to our submission to Scottish Government on the consultation was, yes, we can see why they're there, but we need to be mindful as well that there's not, if you like, any sharp practice, if I can use it in that non-legal term, with regard to how they're being interpreted. So, are you putting Dolly, your pet sheep, onto 3 different fields as a way of precluding an opportunity for a community to actually focus on a particular piece of land which they would argue is going to contribute to their sustainable development. So I think we need to be mindful in relation to how these categories of excluded land are actually interpreted in practice, and the guidance, I imagine, and other documentation is going to be really important, as I think in other forms of the community right to buy, with regard to what the possibilities and the lack of possibilities might be in that sense.
Hamish?
Yeah, and I think in general our view would be that the exclusions that are there seem entirely reasonable and understandable. I suppose, yes, of course, there's the case for misuse, but as you say, we just need to be alert for that. And I think I would be nervous about kind of tightening them further, because that's the other side of the coin in terms of actually this right to buy being sufficiently applicable. And I think it's really important that there is, this is usable in all sorts of different circumstances around Scotland. And it seems to me that with the criteria there and the public interest test, there is the ability to be able to step in and spot any sharp practice or spot deliberate misuse of those. So they seem pretty well framed as far as we can tell at the moment.
John.
I was going to say, again, I think it will be down to Scottish ministers to almost run a judgment on whether the exclusions in any particular case are reasonable. I'm thinking of a householder who might have a private water supply that's drawn from several hundred metres away. Conceivably, they could have their own hydro scheme and claim that the catchment of the hydro scheme was supplying the electricity to the house. And I don't think I would be keen if that was being used as a reason not to, to exclude several hundred or thousand acres from a community bid. But I think, again, that's something that the Scottish ministers will have to tackle and make decisions on as and when cases come forward. It'd be very difficult to try and fix a rule here.
Malcolm.
Yeah, it was just so there's 8 bullets are sort of listed as to things that are excluded in terms of what wouldn't be eligible for buying, and the 8th bullet says for access to the individual's home if the land is owned by the same person that owns the home, because that's recognising the situation where you've got a servitude of access to your home and a change in the ownership of the burdened area of land wouldn't actually affect your access rights. So there's no need to exclude that from the operation of the right to buy. There are actually a couple of other points in the other bullets, so the land in relation to drainage, perhaps, the land for the storage of vehicles. These are rights that can also be represented in Scots law by servitude rights. So and this is the point that I made in the submission alongside Alistair Macpherson and Donna Mackenzie-Skeen. The tail of the 8th bullet, that if the land is owned by the same person that owns the home, that could also be applied to the 3rd bullet in relation to drainage and the 2nd bullet in relation to the storage of vehicles, because it is possible for these rights to exist in relation to land that is owned by someone else rather than the homeowner. This is a point that arguably we should have made back in 2018, because it would have applied equally to the regulations in relation to the abandoned, neglected and detrimental land. So apologies for being 2 years late in that regard, but I think it is worth at least logging that now, and I'd be happy to speak to that if you wanted any further clarification on that.
Okay. Dermot.
Observation from us, at least, that it's quite narrowly drawn. So you've individual being excluded, and we support that, and then you've got government land being excluded, but there's nothing in the middle in terms of other forms of ownership. I mean, speaking from a charitable perspective, we own assets for public benefit, but you think that the local community group might own an asset for public benefit. That's not covered. It's been left to kind of Scottish Minister's judgment as to who's got the greater public interest. In our own case, we've also got the added burden of inalienability, where some parts of our ownership be declared inalienable, which limits our ability to sell them, which then goes to parliamentary test. So it seems there's been quite a kind of big band of other types of public ownership interest left out of this, and it's been left to Scottish ministers to judge on it.
Mark, do you want to follow up on that? 'Cause I know you had an issue around that, Finlay. Could I bring Finlay in quickly and then come back to Mark?
Yeah, I wanted you to consider what the implications of excluding land from the government or the Crown or local authority, because we see many examples of decisions taken by the local authority are often not seen in the interests of the community that are directly affected. So how does the implications of that, how is that going to work in practice? Is that a major exclusion that needs to be looked at? And the Crown Estate, for example, with, there was a suggestion that communities have the right to control foreshores and whatever, and so on. So what are the implications of this, excluding those sections?
John.
Scottish public authorities, so local authorities or Scottish Forestry and S&H and so on, are covered by the asset transfer provision. So I think in most cases, communities will be much more likely to go through that process. Which the big omission, I suspect, in terms of land in Scotland is that owned by UK bodies like the Ministry of Defence or Railtrack, I guess. and so on, that are not covered by the asset transfer provisions. And therefore there isn't that route available to the community, and now there isn't this route. So I think there is, particularly Ministry of Defence is an odd one, because there have been a number of cases of successful community rights to buy using Part 2 of the 2003 Act from Ministry of Defence defence estates. So I'm not entirely clear why it is excluded from this Act.
Sandra.
Say there's anomalies in this legislation when you compare and contrast it with the previous community right to buys. So I'm not clear myself why land or assets belonging to UK ministers is excluded, and I can't see any other reference to that in the community right to buy, Crofton community right to buy, asset transfer, etc. Well, asset transfer is different because it's to do with Scottish public authority, so that is different. In terms of land that falls to the Crowns, this is land where, say, a company or an asset for a company has dissolved and they haven't divested themselves of their assets, that would then fall to the Crown. Or if somebody dies intestate, their assets would fall to the Crown. Now, my understanding is that that's actually in the primary legislation, so perhaps beyond changing at this stage. But in terms of Part 3A, Bona Vacantia and Ultimas Haeres are excluded, so it's consistent with Part 3A. But Part 3A and Part 2, which is the community right to buy, don't exclude, as far as I can see, assets belonging to UK ministers.
Okay.
Sorry.
Can I bring in Callum quickly, and then we'll come back to you?
Very quickly, I mean, I have to reiterate and support that point from Sandra in relation to not seeing the rationale for excluding that type of land, basically, because, you know, there are lots of examples, and you mentioned, Mr. Carson, the foreshore and rights there. There are lots of examples of that type of land where that would be helpful for communities. And when we're talking about the community asset transfer process, that's a right to ask for that to happen. And Scottish Land Commission research, which Annie's mentioned already, actually clearly says there's quite a long way to go in terms of the cultural position that a lot of public authorities have with regard to where they see those assets, in whose hands and for whose benefit, that I think we need to tackle as well.
Finlay.
It's a daft laddie question, and John might be able to answer it. You touched on military defence land, but there's also UK property like DVLA or vehicle testing facilities that are redundant now. Is there a right to buy south of the border? That just doesn't apply to Scotland. So can communities apply to take over these properties south of the border, but it just, because there's different legislation up here, that's not covered?
I'm not an expert, even less of an expert on legislation south of the border, but no, I don't think there is any formal mechanisms.
Is not. I mean, the nearest to it is the Localism Act 2011, which gives communities a sort of right to bid for 6 months, but even then that right to bid is just that, and the landowner doesn't need to choose to accept that bid. It allows them 6 months to get their show in order, but not necessarily even in the road at the end of the day to torture the vehicle analogy too much. So.
Mark, do you want to come back? Claudia.
Thank you, Convener. It's a quick supplementary question on the exclusions, and I think I'm correct in saying that Scottish Land and Estates is highlighted in your submission the concerns about the local development plan in relation to Part 5. Is there any comment you've got on that as to why that would be the case?
So we looked to essentially the new act, I think it's been mentioned before, the new Planning Act, that is, has a new purpose, which includes sustainable development and also the public interest. That essentially, if any local development plan allocation is made, it should be in the public interest, looking at sustainable development. And the initial kind of thought behind that was that if something is in the local development plan, it is likely to already meet a public interest and be in interest of sustainable development, and perhaps not meet one of the 5 tests for this regulation. It was just something that we thought might be better borne out and included.
Could I just ask the convener if there are other comments on that?
Yes, thank you very much, convener. Obviously read that particular submission and the one from I think it's the Property Federation as well, with considerable interest. Community Land Scotland does not think that that is an appropriate approach to take, not least because with the Planning Act and with National Performance Framework 4, we have an agenda, a policy agenda around rural repopulation. We've got issues around local place plans and which organisations might actually be involved in shaping and developing and managing these place plans, and local communities and community bodies may well be organisations that could actually be part of that process. So I think it would be detrimental to the sustainability of areas to follow that through. And as an aside, as a follow-on from that, with regard to other exemptions, there was, I think, a suggestion made that protected areas might be exempt as well. I'm not entirely clear what protected areas are in this context, but if we're talking about designations, for example, whether they're environmental or otherwise, or indeed local development plans, if you do that, and it would be inconsistent with any of the other community rights to buy that we already have in terms of their applicability, what you would be, in effect, be doing, and let's take national scenic areas as one example of that, you would be cutting out great swathes of Scotland's rural land as being applicable or eligible in terms of this particular community right to buy. And for the same reason, using second or empty homes as being ineligible as well actually flies in the face of rural sustainability in terms of actually getting access to affordable homes and putting empty homes back into.
Because there could be a fundamental disagreement with the community on what, for example, say a local authority want to do with their land.
Yeah.
I have an example in my constituency. There's a fundamental disagreement about the objectives of what the local authority have got for this land based on environmental reasons. And I guess that is a tension there that maybe isn't quite addressed.
And that becomes a public interest argument again, which we come back to, of course.
Yeah. Come to Annie, and then Hamish.
Well, my point's just very brief following up on that. I think understanding what the public interest is very difficult if you're a volunteer in a rural community, and so having to address that with the local authority could be quite a challenge, but more discussion needs to be had about what is local level sustainable development and what is in the public interest, and having a national conversation about that in the context of planning reform.
Hamish.
Yeah, I think from a Land Commission perspective, I don't think we would support the extension of exclusions to include those types of examples in terms of development allocations or designated sites. I think partly because, yes, they would exclude a very significant part of Scotland, but I think as fundamentally, it seems to me that that would be prejudging the public interest and it would essentially undermine the point of the right to buy, which is precisely to look at and to weigh up the public interest in the specific local circumstances.
Right. We move on to questions from Claudia. Yes, back to you. Can I just stop you there, because I've completely ignored Gavin and John, who wanted to come in that last point. Can I come to Gavin first?
Sure.
And then John?
Yeah. Sorry. I mean, I take all the points that have been made. I think the reason we wanted to have this kind of point made was to kind of emphasise the sustainable development angle of this, particularly looking at if you cannot do something with a particular piece of land because it's been designated, for example, that should be taken into consideration, and perhaps not every community has the capacity to understand that. And I'm quite happy to have that sort of things defined a bit more clearly in guidance rather than having it included as extra exclusions.
Okay, and John.
I was going to say, particularly with reference to allocation in local development plan, as when a case comes forward to Scottish ministers presumably would look at allocation in local development plan as one of the sort of factors in judging the public interest. And there's a clear principle in Part 2 of the community right to buy that communities can't try and buy assets to frustrate development, to stop things happening. I think actually in this case it's more likely that communities will want to buy the asset in order to fulfill the allocation in the local development plan. Been recently working with a community that wants to create affordable housing. The local authority says, well, you have a site right next to your village that's allocated, but the landowner has no interest in developing that site for affordable housing, so the community's stuck in this kind of limbo of local authority says, yes, but here, and they can't actually access it. So I think it's more likely that communities will want to buy the asset in order to deliver what's in the local development plan than to try and frustrate it.
Yeah. With apologies, back to you, Claudia.
Thanks. I'd like to focus our minds on a discussion of the specified types of area for defining a community, which I slightly shudder when I recall back to the Land Reform Act, but that's some time ago, and things have now shaped up pretty well, I hope, but we'll hear from the panel. So the types of area which a community may be defined by, for the public record really, as everyone here will know, is an electoral ward, the area of a community council, a postcode, district or sector, an island, and a locality or settlement delineated on the maps included in the population estimates for settlements and localities in Scotland in mid-2016. Now, the questions that we have are twofold. Do the provisions adequately cover all possible eventualities and situations in relation to communities that might want to use them? Is it possible that certain communities might be excluded? And are the provisions in keeping with other community rights to buy? If they differ, is there a good reason for them to do so? So there may be, of course, there was the communities of interest that was raised previously, and other issues that the panel might want to highlight and comment on.
Okay, so definition of community. Annie, I saw you nodding your head as Claudia was speaking. Do you want to
well, yeah,
respond?
community definitions is a really interesting part of social science. And I don't know if I have any more to add to this list. I think I would turn to the more legal heads in the room. But I'm really interested if the guidance could consider how communities might be able to work together. So perhaps if they don't necessarily, if they cross boundaries, for instance, or they're part of a landscape, whether there's an opportunity to overcome capacity limitations by forming visions for their place together.
Okay. Anyone else? Sandra?
I think the legislation has been broadened. When it first was implemented, it was quite narrow in terms of how you could define your community. I think it's been added to, and that's to the benefit to enable communities, because most communities tend to know what is their natural community. I'm not aware of any significant issues in terms of limitations in the current drafting and the provisions that have just been outlined. I think there is some confusion for communities because new legislation comes in after existing legislation. So I think a point John might have made was that communities are going back and having to redraft their constitutions to accommodate the new legislation. I think we're coming to the end of the suite of right to buys. There are templates available to help communities. So I don't see the drafting in the legislation as being a barrier. I think it's pretty workable, and I'm working with communities frequently. Most of them tend to use postcodes, but they've got other options as well.
John?
Yeah, as I understand it, this is lifted again from Part 3A, so this is the same set of rules. And I think the primary legislation allows communities not just to define themselves in terms of one electoral ward or one postcode sector, but by parts and combinations. The only query I have is why it's fixed at the localities and settlements of 2016. And I appreciate that's in the 3A rules as well, but NRS update their localities and settlements every 4 years, it seems to me. So 10 years down the line, if we're trying to future-proof this, this will be 2 or 3 iterations of localities and settlements out of date. I'm not quite clear why. There's probably a good legal reason that I don't understand, but fixing it to 2016 seems strange.
Malcolm?
Yeah, I flew a bit of a kite in my consultation response in terms of proposing a slightly newfangled way of defining a community, imagining an area of land which has been somehow fragmented or subdivided. So let's imagine there was a 100-acre site and it was split off 25 years ago and 40 acres was sold off. And basically saying if someone was trying from one area of the land, wanted to reacquire that so as to consolidate the previously, what had now been fragmented back into a site as a whole, that there would have been some historic co-management of that resource when it was together as that bigger site. You would be able to check what this site was through Registers of Scotland, and you could maybe have a cut-off of a certain number of years, maybe 100 years for some kind of sunset rule, or 20 years if you thought a shorter period would be appropriate. But it was just another way to perhaps show what a community would be. And I thought with the sort of particular role of this community right to buy in terms of overcoming certain barriers to sustainable development, these might be particularly shared if the land had previously been in the same ownership unity. It was a thought. It's not based on anything other than me having a stab in the dark as to whether this might be an issue. I'll just refer you back to my consultation response for a bit more detail.
Okay. Dermot.
Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, I think it is in line with the other rights to buy, the sort of general tenor of these things, but I think it comes from a kind of rural perspective, excuse me, a rural perspective on what land reform is about. And from a conservation perspective, a lot of these assets are very, very expensive. It takes quite an aggregation of interests to actually make them happen. And thinking about things, you know, in terms of sport, recreation, religion, culture, you might require a kind of city scale, even a regional scale community of interest to take on an asset. And I think it's kind of missing piece of the jigsaw generally in land reform is that scale of community of interest and how they get represented.
Okay. We're rapidly running out of time. We still have a couple of questions from Annie Wells to put to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Convener. Thank you for coming in today. It's been fascinating. This is my first sort of a step into this, and it's been truly fascinating. So I've just got a couple of questions. With regards to restrictions on the dealings while an application is pending. So basically, it's any transfer of the ownership of the land that is subject to an application or any action taken with a view to a transfer of land. So the questions are, do these provisions adequately cover all possible eventualities and situations in relation to restricting activities? And is it possible that these restrictions may impact upon the landowner's ability to undertake certain actions in relation to their land?
John?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think we expect, and we would always advise community bodies to go through part 2 first, so they would have an existing prohibition on transfer, which matches very closely what's in this, even before they get into the beginning of the part 5 process. So I think the rules that are there are probably fine. Actually, I suspect in almost all cases, they'll only be duplicating what's there beforehand that make sure the landowner, if they are minded to try and avoid the part 5 rules, don't try and make the transfer of asset before the part 5 restriction on transfer comes into force, because it only happens when the application is made to Scottish ministers, or actually when the thing goes up on the register, whereas obviously the landowner will see the community coming from a very long way away because they have to write more than 6 months in advance and they have to have a ballot and so on. So the part 2 prohibition comes into effect to prevent transfer beforehand, and I think it would just carry forward as long as the community kept their part 2 registration active.
Any other panel members got any input? Malcolm?
Just one quick point, and it's I should acknowledge the role of my former colleague Don Mackenzie-Skeen in forming this point. The proposed exceptions include vesting of the land as a result of sequestration, bankruptcy, but the exceptions don't cover trust deeds for creditors because there's no vesting in that situation, just as a sort of insolvency law point. So it's just to query whether or not this is a deliberate point. Again, there's a bit more, for those who like insolvency law, there's a bit more detail in the submission, but it's something to consider. So
Daft Lassie question, what's vesting?
Vesting, so that's in terms of when the right comes across to the person who is dealing with the insolvency process. Mm-hmm. And the point being, if you set up a trust deed for creditors, you wouldn't get the same vesting process as you would in the formal insolvency situation under the new bankruptcy legislation or any other insolvency process that was mandated in statute. So, as I say, it's maybe something that's not going to be very relevant in many situations, and I am speaking to a point that my colleague Donna Mackenzie-Skeen knows far more about than I do, but it's possibly a slight gap.
Okay. Annie?
I think that answered my question.
Yep. Well, I just want to thank you all for your time this morning. It's been very interesting, and it's flagged up a few things that we might want to look into. That concludes the committee's business in public today. We're now going to move into private session. Can I ask that the gallery be cleared as the public part of the meeting is now closed?